He slammed the boy's face down onto the saloon table so hard the tin cup flew across the room. "Tell me where she hid it," Silas Crow's man snarled, twisting the 7-year-old's arm behind his back. "Or I swear I'll break every bone in this child's hand before his mama finishes screaming." The entire saloon went silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And that was the moment Elias Mercer set down his fork. If you were sitting in that room, if you watched a grown man use a child as a weapon while 30 people stared at their boots, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week I bring you stories just like this one, raw, unforgettable, and built to stay with you long after the last word. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if something in this touches you, like it. Let's begin. The bread was stale. Elias Mercer knew it before he bit into it. He'd known it from the way the barkeep set the plate down without meeting his eyes, which was the universal frontier language for "this is all we got, and I'm embarrassed to charge you for it." But Elias ate it anyway, slowly, methodically, the way a man eats when the meal isn't really about food, when it's about filling time, when it's about having something to do with his hands so he doesn't have to think about everything else. The saloon in Blackstone Ridge was the kind of place that had given up on itself about a decade before anyone said it out loud. The floorboards had warped from summer heat and winter ice cycling through them for 30 years, and half the nails had surrendered to the wood. The mirror behind the bar had a crack running diagonally from top right to bottom left, so every man who looked into it saw himself split in two. Elias had been sitting at the corner table for 40 minutes, and he hadn't looked at the mirror once. I was 44 years old. He had the kind of face that had been handsome at some point, and then life had happened to it. A jaw that sat too heavy now, eyes that had retreated somewhere behind weather-darkened skin. His hands, resting beside the plate, were surveyor's hands, scarred across the knuckles, ink-stained at the right forefinger, steady in the way that only comes from years of holding instruments still in wind. He had a job 3 miles east of town, a federal survey contract for land parceling along the ridge. He'd arrived 2 days early because arriving 2 days early meant he didn't have to speak to anyone at the office before the work started. That was the kind of calculation Elias made constantly. Not about money or strategy, but about silence. How to build a life with as much silence in it as possible. He took another bite of the bread. The door opened. He didn't look up immediately. People came into saloons, that was the nature of saloons. But something in the particular quality of the silence that followed, the way the scraping of chairs and the low murmur of conversation just paused, the way a creek pauses when something blocks it upstream, made him raise his eyes. She was standing in the doorway with the child pressed against her side, not clinging to her, pressed. The boy, 7, maybe 8, small for his age regardless, had positioned himself in a way that was less childlike and more like something you see in men who have spent time in dangerous places. His back against her hip, his eyes moving across the room before hers did. Checking exits, checking faces. A child shouldn't know how to do that. The woman herself was tired was the first word. Not sleepy. Tired in the deep structural way, the way a fence post gets tired after years of holding the same tension. She was probably 30, maybe 32, and might have been striking once, but right now her face was a collection of decisions that had cost her something. Her dress had been repaired in at least 4 places Elias could identify from across the room. Her boots were on the wrong side of their last resoling, but she held her chin up. That was the thing Elias noticed. Every other element of her posture was exhausted and guarded and calculating the cost of every movement. But her chin was up, not defiant, not proud, just refusing. Whatever had tried to push it down, she'd refused to let it. She scanned the room. Her eyes landed on the barkeep, then moved to the tables, then, briefly, for less than a second, landed on Elias before moving on. He got the impression she had assessed and cataloged him in that fraction of a second in a way that was more thorough than most men managed in 5 minutes. Then she walked to the bar. Elias went back to his bread. He heard her voice, but not the words. The barkeep's response was short. Her voice again, quieter. Another short response. And then a silence that had a specific shape to it, the shape of someone trying to figure out their next step when the step they'd planned isn't available. It was almost finished with the bread. There was a piece left, roughly half a slice, sitting at the edge of the plate. He'd been planning to leave it, He wasn't hungry anymore, and the bread was stale, and there was no point finishing something out of obligation when the obligation was to no one. The boy made a sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly distressing. It was the kind of sound a child makes when they're trying not to make a sound and their body overrules them. A short, involuntary press of breath through the nose. Almost a sniff. Almost nothing. But Elias had spent 5 years in a house with a child, and his body recognized that sound before his mind had time to engage with it. He looked over. The boy was staring at the bread on his plate, not the way children stare at sweets or toys. The way they stare at something that their body has recognized as survival, and their mind hasn't caught up yet, just looking, without even being aware he was looking. Elias looked at the woman. She was still at the bar, still in conversation with the barkeep, her back to the boy. She hadn't seen. Or, no, she had seen. Her spine had stiffened by approximately 3 degrees, which meant she'd registered exactly what her son was doing and was having the specific experience of a parent who wants to protect their child from their own circumstances and cannot. Elias pushed back his chair. He picked up the plate and walked to the bar and set it down beside her. "He can have the rest of this," Elias said. "I'm done with it." The woman turned. Up close she was, more than he'd registered from across the room. Her eyes were gray, which wasn't unusual, but they had that quality of having seen too much and decided to keep going anyway, which was unusual. She looked at him the way people look at strangers who do unexpected things, with the specific calculation of what does this cost me? "We don't need charity," she said. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't proud. It was just a fact she was reporting, the way you tell someone the road is washed out. Informational. This is the situation. "It's not charity," Elias said. "It's stale bread I'm not going to eat, and it's going to get thrown out. If you don't take it, I'll leave it here and Tommy will throw it." He nodded at the barkeep, who had the good sense to look elsewhere. "Seems wasteful." "A beat. His name is Noah," she said. "Okay." She looked at him for another second, that thorough, cataloging look, and then turned to her son. "Noah." The boy looked up. "The gentleman is offering you some bread." Noah looked at Elias. Elias looked at Noah. The boy had his mother's eyes, same gray, same quality of having taken in more than a child should be expected to absorb. "Thank you," Noah said. Careful, precise, like he'd been taught to be careful with that phrase in particular. "You're welcome," Elias said, and went back to his table. He had nothing left on the plate. He had nothing left to do at the table. He should have paid and left, and instead he sat there, which he recognized was strange, and didn't examine too closely. Behind him, he could hear the low conversation resume between the woman and the barkeep. He heard the barkeep use the word tonight, and then the woman's response was too quiet, and then the barkeep again. "Can't help you there, ma'am." Something was being negotiated, or failing to be negotiated. Something about a room, or transport, or both. He ordered a coffee he didn't need. The coffee arrived. He held the cup. The barkeep, Tommy, a heavy-set man who'd been running this place since Elias could remember, leaned against the bar near him and said, very quietly, "She come in yesterday asking about the stage route to Denver. Couldn't pay for passage. Come back today." "Not my business," Elias said. "No," Tommy agreed. "Suppose not." He drifted back down the bar. Elias drank his coffee. He was halfway through it when the door opened again. 2 men. He registered them the way he registered weather. Not because he was looking for trouble, but because certain things announced themselves as requiring registration. These men had that quality. They were dressed for work, both of them, but the work they were dressed for wasn't anything legal. They had the look of men who were paid to be somewhere specific and to accomplish something specific, and weren't particular about how. They scanned the room differently than the woman had. She'd been looking for safety. These men were looking for a target. Their eyes found the woman at the bar, and stopped. Elias set down his coffee cup. Neither man moved immediately. They stood just inside the door, and one of them, the taller one, with a jaw like a shovel blade, said something to the other, low, and the other one almost smiled, which was the particular expression of someone who has been tasked with doing something unpleasant and has resolved to enjoy it. The tall one walked to the bar. He stopped next to the woman. Close. Closer than was warranted by any ordinary purpose. He looked at her the way people look at things they already consider theirs. "Vivian," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, just, identifying her. The way you identify property you've been sent to retrieve. The woman, Vivian, went very still. Noah moved closer to her, and the motion was the same motion as before. That not childlike positioning, back to the bar now, eyes on the tall man. You're a long way from Harlan County, the tall man said. I'm not going back, Vivian said. Well? He set his hand on the bar between her and the exit, not touching her, just closing off. That ain't really the question, is it? The question is what you got sewn into that dress, and whether you want to hand it over here or whether you'd rather make this complicated. The saloon had gone quiet again. That upstream blockage silence. I don't know what you mean, Vivian said. Sure you don't. Tommy the barkeep had disappeared through the back. The handful of other patrons had developed a sudden intense interest in their drinks. Elias sat at his corner table and watched the tall man's partner drift sideways, positioning himself between the back exit and the room, blocking both doors. The tall man leaned slightly toward Vivian. His voice dropped, though not low enough. Crow wants it back, he said. That's all. You hand over what you took and you take the boy and you go wherever you want. That's a fair offer. That's a generous offer. And if I don't? Something passed through the tall man's face that wasn't anger. Anger would have been better. It was calculation. The specific, unhurried calculation of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how it ends. Then we take it, he said. And the boy doesn't complicate anything for us. We've been riding 4 days. We're tired. Don't make this complicated. Noah made a sound. Again, that involuntary breath sound, the one Elias had heard from across the room. Except this time it was fear, not hunger, and the difference between those two sounds was something that went into Elias Mercer's chest like a key into a lock. He stood up. The chair scraped on the warped floorboards and every head in the room turned. He walked to the bar. Not fast, not slow. The particular pace of a man who has decided something and is in no hurry about it because the decision is already made. He stopped on the other side of Vivian from the tall man. You need something, the tall man said. I need you to take 3 steps back, Elias said, and let this woman finish her conversation with me. A beat. Her conversation with you. We were in the middle of something when you came in. He looked at Vivian. Sorry about that. You were saying. Vivian stared at him, the same thorough cataloging look, faster this time, processing something with considerable urgency. I was saying, she said slowly, that I would appreciate passage to Denver. Right, Elias said. And I was saying I have a wagon leaving tomorrow morning. You and the boy are welcome to ride along. I've got room. He looked at the tall man. We were just working out the details. The tall man looked at Elias, looked at him with the specific interest of someone recalibrating, trying to figure out what they're dealing with. Elias met the look evenly and said nothing, which was a skill he'd spent years developing. I don't know who you are, the tall man said. Federal surveyor, Elias said. Contract with the Territorial Land Office, which means I've got a federal requisition badge in my coat and a contact at the Denver Marshal's office I correspond with regularly, which means if anything happens in this saloon tonight, there's a paper trail. He paused. I'm not telling you that to be threatening. I'm just working out the details. The tall man's jaw tightened. His partner, by the back exit, had gone very still. Elias waited. The tall man looked at Vivian one more time. That proprietary look, heavy with something that wasn't just Silas Crow's orders, that had a personal quality to it. And then he straightened. We'll be around, he said. I imagine so, Elias said. The 2 men left. The saloon door swung shut. For 3 seconds, nobody in the room breathed. Then one of the patrons at a far table exhaled audibly, and someone's glass touched the bar, and the ordinary sounds of a saloon trickled slowly back in. Vivian turned to Elias. You don't have a wagon, she said. I have a horse and a supply cart, he said. It's not comfortable. You don't know me. No. You don't know what I'm carrying or what's after me. I can infer some of it. She looked at him for a long time. Across the bar, Noah had finished the bread and was watching Elias with those gray eyes that saw everything and said very little. Why? She said. It wasn't rhetorical. She actually wanted the answer. Elias considered the question honestly. He thought about the stale bread. He thought about the way Noah had looked at it. He thought about the sound, that particular involuntary breath, and the thing it had opened up in him that he'd spent years being very careful to keep shut. "I'm not sure yet," he said, "but I'll figure it out on the road." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "The men who were just here," she said quietly, "they're not the worst ones Crow sent." "I know. If you help me, they will come for you too." "I know that also." "Then, ma'am," Elias said, and something in his voice was patient in a way that was different from professional patience. That was the patience of someone who has been very alone and has therefore had a great deal of time to think about what actually matters. "I've been eating stale bread by myself for 11 years. I think I can manage a complicated wagon ride." Vivian looked at him. Noah looked at him. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out enough coins to cover the coffee and the bread and left them on the bar. "We leave at first light," he said. "I'll be outside. You don't have to come. But if you do, bring only what you can carry and don't tell anyone else we're going." He walked toward the door. Behind him, he heard Vivian say, very quietly, as if to herself, "What kind of man does that?" He heard Noah's voice, equally quiet, answer her with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who has seen more of the world than any 7-year-old should have. "A good one," Noah said, "I think." Elias pushed open the saloon door and stepped out into the Blackstone Ridge night, where the tall man and his partner were nowhere visible, which meant they were watching from somewhere he couldn't see, which meant tomorrow was going to be considerably more complicated than any ordinary wagon ride to Denver. He stood under the stars and looked east, where the survey land waited patiently, where the job he'd arrived 2 days early for in order to avoid conversation now sat beside a road that would take him somewhere very different. He thought about the federal badge in his coat. He thought about the contact at the Denver marshal's office, who was real, who he corresponded with, who owed him a professional courtesy or two. He thought about what the tall man had said, sewn into that dress. And what category of thing gets sewn into a dress by a woman traveling alone with a child through rough country with men 4 days behind her? Documents, the kind that mattered, the kind that got people killed. He breathed the night air and thought, "You're a surveyor, you map land. That's what you do. You don't get involved in things like this anymore." And then he thought about Noah's voice saying a good one, I think, with the absolute uncomplicated certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to be cynical about such assessments. He went to check on his horse. Inside the saloon, Vivian Holloway stood at the bar with her son beside her, looking at the door Elias had just walked through, holding in her hands the weight of everything she'd carried for 14 months. The forged deeds, the sworn statements, the names of the dead, the proof of who had killed them and why. And she made the calculation she'd been making every day since she'd understood what she was holding. Can I trust this person? She'd been wrong before. She'd trusted her attorney in Harlan County, and his office had been emptied before she arrived. She'd trusted a freight driver in Millard Pass who'd taken her money and then vanished. She stopped that thought because some things you don't look at directly. Noah leaned against her. "Mama?" he said. "What, sweetheart?" He didn't finish the bread. She looked at the empty plate on the bar. The bread was gone. Noah had eaten it, but she understood what her son meant. Elias had left the bread not as an act of noblesse, not as performance, but as the unremarked, unexamined instinct of someone who simply didn't need it and saw someone who did. "We haven't eaten in days," she'd said to Tommy, the barkeep, broken and quiet. In a moment she'd thought no one had overheard, and the man in the corner had given her everything he had on that plate, just like that. No asking why, no condition attached. She looked at the door. "Okay," she said to herself, to Noah, to the very tentative possibility that the world had not completely used up all of its decent men. "Okay." She picked up the small bag that held the documents, the stitching thick at the bottom where she'd reinforced it, where the leather was slightly stiffer than it should be, where 14 months of running felt like it was pressing up through the seams, and she said to Noah, "Get your coat." "Are we going with him?" She didn't answer immediately. The tall man's face was still in her memory. Crow wants it back. Not Crow is offering. Not there's a deal to be made. Just, we take it. As if the only question was when, not whether. She'd run as far as she could run alone. "Yes," she said. "We're going with him." Noah put on his coat. Outside, somewhere in the dark of Blackstone Ridge, Elias Mercer was checking his horse's shoes and thinking about a road he'd never surveyed, and a woman he'd met 45 minutes ago, and a child who thought he was good. and two men were watching the saloon from the shadows of an alley they'd found comfortable enough, sending word back down the line to a man named Silas Crow that the package had been located, that the woman had a protector now, that things would need to be handled differently than planned. And Silas Crow, in his Denver office with its leather chairs and its territorial maps, read the message and felt nothing except mild inconvenience, because he had not built what he had built by worrying about surveyors. He had built it by being the kind of man who did not stop. And neither, as it turned out, though none of them knew this yet, had Vivian Holloway. They were gone before the first gray edge of light touched the eastern ridge. Elias had the cart loaded and the horse harnessed by 4 a.m, working in the dark by feel and habit, the way a man works when he has spent enough years alone that he no longer needs light to navigate his own life. He'd done a supply run the evening before, not from the general store in town, which would have been noticed, but from the freight depot on the south edge of Blackstone Ridge, where the overnight clerk was half asleep and not inclined toward conversation. Dried meat, hardtack, a canvas tarp, an extra wool blanket that smelled like the depot's storage room and would need airing out but would keep a child warm on a mountain night regardless. Vivian and Noah were waiting at the south end of the main street when he pulled up, and the fact that they were already there, packed, ready, standing in the dark without complaint, told him something about the kind of running they'd been doing before he'd entered the picture. They'd learned how to leave places. Noah was carrying a canvas bag almost as big as he was. Vivian carried nothing except a smaller leather satchel pressed against her body with her left arm, which Elias noted and did not mention. "Anyone see you leave?" he asked. "I don't think so." "That's not the same as no." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He helped Noah onto the cart seat and Vivian climbed up herself without waiting for his hand, which also told him something. They pulled out of Blackstone Ridge going south, which was not toward Denver. Elias had spent part of the previous night, the hours he hadn't spent sleeping, which were most of them, thinking about the road. The obvious route to Denver ran northwest on the main freight trail, which was also the fastest route and the most watched route, and therefore the route that two men who'd ridden 4 days to find them would anticipate completely. I was going south first, then east, then north through the Carver Creek Pass, which was a survey route he'd walked twice and which appeared on approximately nobody's official maps because it had been assessed and then deprioritized by the territorial office 6 years ago. It would add 2 days to the journey. It would also make them invisible for those 2 days, which seemed like a worthwhile trade. He didn't explain all of this to Vivian immediately. He explained the first part, that they were going south, that it wasn't the wrong direction, that he had a reason. And she nodded once and didn't ask for the rest of it, which suggested she understood that explanations were a luxury for people who had time to sit still, and they did not currently have that. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour. The dark thinned slowly around them. The horse, a reliable brown gelding Elias had named Nothing, because naming animals led to things he didn't need, moved at a steady pace on the dry ground, unhurried, which was the right speed for a cart that needed to leave no obvious cloud of dust on the empty plain. Noah fell asleep sitting upright between them with his head tilted back, which was the particular sleep of children who are exhausted enough that their bodies simply shut down regardless of circumstance. Elias watched him tip sideways and then settle against Vivian's arm, and Vivian adjusted without looking down, the automatic recalibration of a mother who had been doing this for years. "How long have you been running?" Elias asked, quietly, so as not to wake the boy. Vivian considered the question. 14 months, she said, give or take. "Since you took the documents." A pause. "Since I realized what I had," she said. "I'd had them longer than that. It took me a while to understand what I was looking at." He let that sit for a moment. The wheels turned on the packed earth. The horse breathed steadily. "Your husband," he said. Her jaw tightened. He caught it in his peripheral vision. "My former husband," she said. "He died 8 months ago." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She said it without bitterness, which was more disturbing than bitterness would have been. It was the tone of someone reporting something they'd had a long time to process. He was the one who told Crow I had them, before he died. He thought it would protect him. She paused. It didn't. Elias absorbed this. The man who was supposed to be her protection had instead handed her to the wolves, and the wolves had failed to be satisfied with just him. And so here she was, 14 months later, in a supply cart going south in the dark with a stranger. What are they? He asked. The documents. She didn't answer immediately. He could feel her deciding how much to tell him, running the calculation. How much do I need him to know? How much does telling him put him in more danger? How much does not telling him put me in more danger? He waited. He'd learned, over many years of working alone in open country, that silence was not something to fill. Silence was a thing you gave people when they needed room to think. Original land deeds, she said finally. 11 ranches in the Carver Valley region. The families who owned them. Crow bought them out, supposedly. Voluntary sale, fair price. She paused. Except the original deeds show the land was sold to a holding company that doesn't exist. The names on the transfer documents were forged. 3 of the families, the Holloways, the Brestons, the Muir family, they never signed anything. Crow's men signed for them. Using what names? Theirs, the families. The signatures were, someone practiced them, someone good at it. But when you put the original deed next to the transfer document in the right light, the ink is different. The hand pressure is different. I found a notary in Millard County who confirmed it. She stopped. He disappeared 3 weeks later. Elias looked straight ahead at the pale pre-dawn landscape. How many people know you have this? As of right now, you. My attorney in Denver, Nathaniel Cross, and Silas Crow. And whoever Crow sent. Yes. How do you know your attorney hasn't been? I don't, she said. I haven't been able to reach him for 6 weeks. I've sent 4 letters through different post offices. No response. Her voice didn't change when she said this, but something underneath it did. That's part of why this trip is, I need to get there myself. I need to put these in his hands personally. If something's happened. She stopped again, and this time the stopping had a different quality. Not composure, the edge of composure. Then I need to find out, and find someone else. The sky ahead of them had gone from black to a dark blue that was almost purple. The first birds were starting. They were far enough from Blackstone Ridge now that the town was invisible behind them, and the terrain was opening up into the broad, scrubby flatland that preceded the southern rise of the Carver foothills. The 2 men in the saloon, Elias said. The tall one. You knew him. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. His name is Roy Deal, she said. He worked for Crow before I understood who Crow was. He used to come to the house for dinners. A beat. Noah called him Uncle Roy when he was 4. Elias didn't say anything. He's not the dangerous one, Vivian said. He's just the one Crow sends first, because he knows me, because Crow thought I'd be more likely to comply if it was someone familiar. She looked out at the lightening horizon. The dangerous one is a man named Garrett, follows later, always. Deal softens things up, and if that doesn't work, Garrett finishes it. What do you know about Garrett? Enough to be afraid of him, she said. Which I am. I'd rather you know that plainly. He appreciated the plainness of it. All right, he said. Noah stirred between them, made a small noise, and went back to sleep. They rode in silence again. The light was coming faster now, and the world was resolving itself out of darkness. The low scrub brush, the pale grass, the wide-open sky, that was the one thing about frontier country that Elias had never managed to stop finding beautiful, no matter what else had happened in it. He thought about what she'd told him. 11 ranches, forged deeds, a notary who'd vanished, an attorney who wasn't responding, and somewhere behind them, Roy Deal and his partner reassessing their approach, and beyond them, eventually, a man named Garrett. And in Vivian's leather satchel pressed against her left side, the only evidence that any of it had happened. He thought, you are a surveyor. You map land. That is what you do. He thought, you have a federal contract that starts in 3 days, and a supervisor in Denver who will have questions if you don't show up. He thought, the boy called you a good one. He pulled the horse left at the fork that led toward the Carver Creek Trail, and said nothing about any of it. By mid-morning, they'd reached the first tree cover, a long section of scrub pine that climbed the lower foothills and thickened as the elevation rose. The cart tracked badly on the grade, one rear wheel skipping on loose shale twice in 10 minutes, and Elias stopped and wedged a piece of cut wood under the axle housing that solved it well enough to continue. Though the ride got rougher and Noah woke up and didn't complain, which was, Elias had begun to understand, simply Noah's operating mode. The boy was watching everything, not nervously, with genuine, focused attention. He'd sit with his back straight and his gray eyes moving across the terrain as they passed through it. And occasionally he'd say something, there's a creek down there, or "Those tracks are from a big animal." And he was right every time, which meant he'd been paying attention to the natural world in the way that children do when the human world has become unreliable. Around noon, they stopped in a flat section of ground screened on three sides by pines. Elias built no fire. He handed around the dried meat and hardtack, and they ate without ceremony, leaning against the cartwheel in the filtered shade. Noah ate fast, the way he'd looked at the bread the evening before, with the urgency of a body that had learned not to trust that food would stay available. Then he slowed himself down deliberately. Elias caught the deliberateness of it and recognized it as something the boy had taught himself, probably after Vivian had talked to him about it, some conversation about dignity and pace that a mother has with a child when the circumstances require it. "Mr. Mercer," Noah said, "Elias is fine." Noah considered this. "My mother says I should use last names for adults." "She's right. Elias is still fine." Noah almost smiled. "Are those men going to follow us?" Vivian started to say something, and Noah added quickly, "I'm not scared. I just want to know what's actually happening." The particular exhaustion of a child who had been protected from information for his own good and had found the not knowing worse than the knowing. Elias recognized it. He looked at Vivian. She gave him the briefest of nods, "Use your judgment," and then looked away. "Probably yes," Elias said to Noah. "The men from last night. But we're not going the way they'll expect us to go, so we have some time on them." "How much time?" "Depends on how smart they are. Could be a day, could be 3. Noah processed this with the focused seriousness of someone running actual calculations. "Do you have a gun?" "I do." "Do you know how to use it?" "Noah," Vivian said. "It's a fair question," Elias said. "Yes, I know how to use it. I'd rather not have to." He paused. "Most situations, if you think clearly enough, don't require it." "What if they don't think clearly?" "Then we deal with that when it comes." He looked at the boy directly. "You've been doing this for a long time, haven't you? Running." Noah looked at his hardtack. "Since I was 6, he said. "We stopped for a while in Millard. I thought we were going to stay." A pause. "Then we left again." The Millard notary. Elias made the connection and didn't pursue it. "You're doing well," he said to Noah, and meant it without any softness around it, just as a plain assessment, the way he'd have said it to any person doing hard things under hard conditions. Noah looked up. He had the expression of a child who was being told something true and was measuring it for truth and finding it present. "Okay," he said, and went back to his hardtack. They were back on the trail within 20 minutes. The Carver Creek Pass was technically passable by cart, but not designed for it, and Elias spent the afternoon making decisions about the terrain that were half engineering and half intuition. Where to angle the wheels, where to get down and lead the horse. Where the grade was deceptive and the ground was softer than it appeared. He'd surveyed this route twice. The second time had been in autumn, when the creek was lower and the soft ground sections were identifiable by color. This was summer, and the creek was running higher, and some of the soft ground was harder to identify, and he made 2 wrong calls that cost them time before correcting. Vivian helped. She didn't wait to be asked. When the cart needed steadying on a lateral slope, she was off the seat and at the rear wheel before he'd even turned to look. When the horse needed settling on a section of loose rock, she had its head and was murmuring to it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who'd grown up around animals and still knew what they needed. She got it wrong once, tried to steer the horse in a direction that would have tipped the cart on the grade, and when Elias said otherwise, she corrected without defensiveness, the adjustment of someone who cared more about the outcome than about having been right. He liked that about her. He didn't say so. By late afternoon, they'd reached a section of the trail that widened and leveled into an old seasonal meadow. High grass, a run of creek water visible through the trees to the east, and the good news that the worst of the grade was behind them. The bad news, which Elias identified approximately 40 seconds after they entered the meadow, was that they were not alone. There was a camp at the northern edge. 2 tents, a fire that had been active recently, a wagon with a broken rear axle propped on a log, and 3 men who'd heard the cart coming and were already turned toward them, standing in that particular way of people who have learned to be careful about who approaches their camp. Elias kept the horse moving at the same pace. Changing pace would look like either aggression or retreat, and neither was useful. As they got closer, he could see the men more clearly, older, rough-worked hands, the worn-through clothing of people who lived outdoors by necessity rather than choice, not outlaws. Prospectors, possibly, or displaced ranch hands, or any one of the dozen categories of men the frontier generated when economies shifted and families lost their land. He pulled up at a polite distance and called out, "Evening, got a bad axle?" The tallest of the three men. Older, white beard, eyes that had been watchful so long they'd become that by default, said, "Had it 2 days. Waiting on a supply wagon that was supposed to come through with parts." "Where you headed?" "East. Trying to get to family in Dalton County." A pause that wasn't quite a pause. "You?" "Denver," Elias said. "Land office business." The man's eyes moved to Vivian and Noah with the quick assessing motion of someone who was deciding what category to put them in. Elias watched this happen and waited. "You're taking the Carver Trail?" the man said. "Shortcut," Elias said. "I know this stretch. You're going to hit water crossing about 4 miles north. Creek's running high right now. Came through it yesterday. It's manageable, but you'll want to do it early morning, not end of day." Elias filed this. "Obliged." He paused. "You've got enough supplies?" "We can spare some." The man looked at him for a long second, refiling Elias into a different category, and said, "We're all right, but thank you." As they moved past the camp, Noah turned on the seat to look at the broken wagon and the three men, and then turned back around and said nothing, which was, Elias had learned in the space of 1 day what Noah did when he was thinking hardest. 5 minutes later, Noah said, "Will they tell anyone they saw us?" "I don't think so," Elias said. "They've got their own problems." "But they might. They might. So people behind us might know which direction we went." It wasn't a question. Elias looked at the boy and then back at the trail. "Yes," he said, "which is why we're going to make a small adjustment tomorrow morning." Vivian said, "What adjustment?" "I'll tell you when I work it out." She gave him a look that was part patience and part skepticism, which was, he was beginning to understand, her standard expression for situations she was being asked to trust, but hadn't yet verified. He found it reasonable and did not take offense. They camped that night in the tree cover well off the main trail, no fire. Elias strung the canvas tarp between 2 pines for Vivian and Noah and set himself up on the other side of the cart, between it and whatever might come from the south. The gelding was tied short and quiet. The night was cool, and the trees moved in the occasional wind, and nothing came. But at some point in the early hours, Elias woke from a light sleep and sat still in the dark and listened, because something had changed in the quality of the night. Not a sound exactly, more like an absence of a sound that had been present. And after 45 seconds, he identified it as the creek that had been audible at low level all evening, which had now gone slightly quieter, which meant something upstream had disturbed the water, which meant something was moving upstream. Could be an animal, could be men on horseback who'd found the creek path and were following it north. He sat in the dark for another 20 minutes, not moving, listening with the complete focus of a man who has learned that his instincts are sometimes wrong and are also sometimes the only thing that keeps him alive. Nothing else changed. The creek returned to its earlier volume. The night settled. He didn't go back to sleep. In the gray morning, he broke camp quickly and had them moving before full light, and he took the first fork that split away from the creek heading northeast, putting distance between them and the water path. If someone had been following the creek, they'd find the place where the trail diverged and have to choose. And the northeast fork looked, to an eye that didn't know the terrain, like the less traveled option, which meant a tracker making quick decisions in low light would likely take the northwest branch. The northwest branch dead-ended in a box canyon 3 miles in. This was information Elias had from his survey notes, which were in his coat pocket in a small leather-covered notebook, and which he'd spent part of the previous night consulting by moonlight, working out the terrain ahead. He mentioned none of this to Vivian and Noah, partly because explaining it while also navigating it was too much, and partly because there was a category of things you didn't say to people you were trying to protect until you were certain the protection had worked. No point describing the danger in detail until they were past it. Noah sensed it anyway. He rode the first mile of the northeast fork in a particular stillness that was different from his regular stillness, a held quality, like he was keeping himself very small inside. Elias noticed and said nothing. Vivian had her left hand over the leather satchel and was looking backward at regular intervals, which she did without making it obvious, turning to check Noah's bag or adjust the tarp or something else that explained the backward look. Neither of them asked. They were 2 hours into the morning when they heard the riders. Not close, coming from the south-southwest, which was the direction they'd been, not the direction they were going. 2 horses at least, possibly 3, moving at a pace that wasn't galloping but was faster than casual. Moving along the creek path. Elias pulled the cart off the trail into a section of dense pine and sat still. Noah pressed himself flat against the cart bed with the instinct of a child who had done this before, which broke something in Elias's chest in a way he didn't have time to examine. Vivian had her hand on Noah's back and her eyes on Elias, and her face was completely still, the kind of stillness that is not calm, but is the thing you put in front of panic when you've decided panic doesn't help. The riders passed, south to north, staying on the creek path, moving fast. Elias caught the sound of them through the trees, the horse hooves on the wet creek bank, the occasional low voice that wasn't words, just the conversational murmur of men riding together who have something to find. He counted 2 horses in the sound, possibly 3. Couldn't confirm. They went north. Elias sat in the pines for 10 full minutes after the sound faded, not moving, because men who knew what they were doing sometimes sent riders ahead and then waited to see if anything flushed. Nothing flushed. He pulled back onto the trail. "Who were they?" Noah said quietly. Not scared. Asking for information. "Don't know," Elias said. "Maybe nothing to do with us." Noah looked at him with those gray eyes. But maybe. But maybe. Noah nodded, accepting this, and pulled his coat tighter around himself. They reached the northern end of the Carver Creek Pass by mid-afternoon. The water crossing the old man in the camp had described was exactly as he'd said, high, fast, manageable, and something you wanted daylight and a rested horse for. Elias stopped at the bank and looked at it for a while, reading the current, identifying the line that offered the shallowest path. "I need you both in the cart bed," he said. "On top of the tarp. Keep the satchel dry." Vivian didn't argue. She helped Noah into the back and climbed in herself, and Elias walked the horse forward into the water. The creek came up over the wheel hubs and cold water immediately rushed over the floorboards of the cart bed. He heard Noah make a sharp sound. Not fear, just the shock of cold water against his legs. And then silence again as the boy adjusted. The horse pulled against the current with the steady, unhappy effort of an animal doing something it doesn't like but has been asked to do by someone it trusts. And the footing was poor on the creek bed, gravel and loose stone shifting under the hooves, and once the cart lurched hard to the left, and Elias grabbed the harness rail and leaned his weight right and held it, water up to his calves, until the horse found its footing again and kept moving. They came out the other side dripping, the horse blowing hard through its nose, the cart leaving a trail of water across the dry bank. Elias checked the horse's legs first, then the wheel bearings, then turned and looked at Vivian and Noah. Vivian's dress was soaked to the waist. She was holding the leather satchel up out of the water with both hands, pressed to her chest. She'd kept it dry. Noah was wet to the shoulders, which meant he'd reached down to brace the cart during the lurch, which he didn't have to do and probably shouldn't have, and which he was currently looking at Elias with the expression of someone waiting to find out if they did something wrong. "Good thinking on the brace," Elias said. "Next time tell me before you reach over the side." Noah nodded, satisfied. They stopped on the bank to wring out what could be wrung out and spread the wool blanket across Noah's shoulders, and Vivian pulled a second dress from the canvas bag and said, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had stopped finding humiliation in necessity, "Turn around." Elias turned around. He heard the sound of wet fabric and dry fabric, and the movement of a woman changing her clothes in the open air because there was no other option, and he stood watching the creek they'd crossed and thought about the riders he'd heard, and about the box canyon at the end of the Northwest Fork, and about whether whoever was following them was smart enough to backtrack when they found the dead end, and how long that would take. "All right," Vivian said. He turned back. She was dressed, the wet dress in her hands, her hair loose from its pin on one side. She was looking at the creek. "The satchel?" he said. "Dry." She met his eyes. Something in her expression was different from before. Not softer exactly, but the specific opening that happens to a face when a person has decided to increase the amount they trust someone. A small degree shift. "I should tell you what's in it," she said. "Exactly. You should know in case something happens to you," he said. "Yes." He nodded. They started walking again, with Noah ahead of them now, And as the boy moved through the sunlit afternoon examining rocks and calling back observations about animal tracks, Vivian talked. She told him about the 11 ranches and their names. She told him about the 3 families who'd never signed, the Holloway Ranch, which was her own family's land, which was where she'd grown up, which Crow's man had forged her dead father-in-law's signature on and sold for 40 cents on the dollar to a holding company that dissolved itself 6 months later. She told him about the sworn depositions, 4 of them, from ranch hands who'd been present for conversations between Crow's attorney and the county recorder, and who'd understood only later what they'd witnessed. She told him about the deed notary in Millard County who'd certified the original papers and who was the last person she'd spoken to who fully understood what she had before he disappeared, and about the letter he'd written her 3 days before he vanished that was now also in the satchel. He knew, she said. He knew something was coming. The letter says he's already sent copies of his findings to a federal contact in Denver. That was 6 months ago. I don't know if the copies arrived. I don't know if the federal contact is still. I don't know if any of the infrastructure I was counting on is still in place. She stopped walking. Ahead of them, Noah had crouched to examine something in the dirt, tracks from the way he was studying them, and wasn't listening. Nathaniel Cross, she said, my attorney. If he's unreachable, if something happened to him, Elias, I don't have a plan past him. I have everything, every piece of paper. I have it all. And if there's no one in Denver who can file it, who can get it in front of a federal judge before Crow's people, let's find out whether Cross is available before we build that bridge, Elias said. And if he's not, he thought about it honestly. I have a contact at the Denver Marshal's office, he said. I've done survey work for him twice. He's a straight man. If the federal channels aren't available immediately, he can hold the documents securely while we find someone who can file. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this, she said. I've had 2 days, he said, which wasn't completely true. He'd had about 16 hours, but the point was accurate. She was quiet for a moment, then, Elias. Why are you doing this? And I mean really, not the bread answer. He walked for a few steps before answering. I had a wife, he said, and a daughter. 7 years ago, there was a fever that went through the Mercer Valley settlement. My wife caught it in June. My daughter caught it in July. He paused. I was in the field both times. Came back when they sent for me, and I came back too late both times. He looked ahead at Noah, who had stood up from his tracks and was moving forward again. I've been surveying land since then, mapping things, measuring distances between things, making sure the numbers are accurate. He paused again. It's important work, and it doesn't keep me up at night, and I'm good at it, and it doesn't require me to be present in the way I stopped knowing how to be. Vivian said nothing. And then your boy looked at a piece of stale bread, Elias said, and I heard what he sounded like. She was quiet beside him for long enough that he thought the conversation was over. Then she said quietly, his name is on one of those deeds. He looked at her. Noah, she said, my husband, my former husband, before he died, he signed Noah's share of the Holloway Ranch over to Crow's company, without my knowledge. Without Noah's, obviously he was 6, but the point is, she stopped. Crow doesn't just have our land, he has my son's name on a fraudulent document. Legally, if that document stands, Noah Holloway owns nothing and can claim nothing, not in this territory or any adjacent one, because his name is already recorded as part of the transfer. The weight of this settled. He's 7 years old, Elias said. I know. They put a 7-year-old's name on a land fraud document. It protects Crow, she said. If Noah ever tried to claim the land, Crow's attorney would argue that Noah's guardian signed freely, that it's a legal transfer. Her voice stayed level with the effort of someone who has cried about this already, and is no longer in the crying stage but is in the colder, harder stage that comes after. Unless I can get those documents in front of a federal judge who can see the forgeries, unless I can get the whole case filed before they destroy me or the papers or both. Noah had stopped ahead of them and was waiting, looking back. What are you talking about? He called. Logistics, Vivian called back. Is it about the men following us? Part of it. Noah looked at them both for a second, decided this was an acceptable answer, and turned forward again. Elias watched him walk and thought about a 7-year-old boy's name on a piece of paper designed to rob him before he was old enough to understand the concept of property, and felt something in his chest that he recognized as a specific variety of anger, Not hot, not loud, the cold variety. The kind that doesn't make you reckless, but makes you very, very focused. We'll get it filed, he said. You can't promise that, she said. No, he agreed, but I'm telling you anyway. She looked at him sideways, and the expression on her face was the most complicated thing he'd seen since he'd sat down with his stale bread 24 hours ago. Something between exhaustion and relief, and the very careful opening of a door that had been locked for a long time by someone who had good reason to keep it locked. They walked on. The afternoon light was going golden through the pines, the kind of light that makes everything look like it might be all right even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Elias knew they had perhaps 2 hours before they needed to find camp, and he had in mind a section of ground another mile ahead where he'd surveyed a good windbreak and a reliable spring. They could be there before dark. I was running through the next day's route in his mind when Noah stopped walking and turned around, and his face, which had been focused and calm all day, had changed. Someone's coming, Noah said. Elias stopped. He heard nothing. Noah pointed northeast, not back the way they'd come. Northeast, which was the direction they were heading, ahead of them. Elias listened for a full 10 seconds. Then he heard it. Very faint, still a distance off, the sound of a horse moving through brush, slow and careful, the sound of an animal being deliberately quieted. One horse, single rider, coming toward them. Not from behind, from in front, which meant whoever was ahead of them had not followed them through the pass, which meant they'd been waiting. Elias put his hand on Vivian's arm and moved her and Noah sideways into the tree cover without speaking, and the three of them stood in the shadow of the pines and watched the trail ahead. A rider emerged from the tree line. I was riding a gray horse, and he sat in the saddle with the easy stillness of a man who spent most of his life in it. He was perhaps 50, lean in the way that people are lean when they've spent decades burning everything they take in. His hat was pulled low. He had no visible weapons drawn, which told Elias nothing because that was exactly what you did when you were trying not to be threatening, whether you were threatening or not. He stopped his horse in the middle of the trail and waited. He couldn't see them in the tree cover, or if he could, he was making no sign of it. He just sat, patient, like he had time, like he'd known they were coming and had arranged himself accordingly and was content to let the situation develop at whatever pace it chose. Noah's breathing beside Elias was slow and controlled. Vivian's hand was on the satchel. The rider reached up and took off his hat. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, to the trees, to the general space where three people were trying not to exist. His voice was flat and dry and entirely without theater. "My name is Calvin Garrett. I've been paid to find you." He paused. "I found you 3 hours ago. If I meant you harm, you'd already know." Nobody moved. Elias stood in the tree cover with his right hand resting on the grip of his revolver and his left hand slightly out to the side, between Vivian and whatever happened next. And he looked at the man on the gray horse who had just announced his own name and his own purpose without being asked, which was either the most honest thing a hunter had ever done or the most calculated. Calvin Garrett sat on his horse and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was a weapon. "Step down," Elias said from the trees. "Slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." "All right," Garrett said. "No resistance? No theater?" He swung down from the saddle with the careful movement of a man who is deliberately making himself less threatening, which was not the same thing as being less threatening, and tied the gray to a branch and stepped back from it with both hands open at his sides. Elias came out of the trees first. Vivian stayed behind with Noah, which she'd done without being asked, which meant she was thinking the same way he was. He kept the distance at 8 feet and watched Garrett's hands and his eyes and the particular way he was holding his body, which told you, if you knew how to read it, more than a man's words ever did. Garrett was reading him the same way. "You've been following us since the creek crossing," Elias said. It wasn't a question. "Since the meadow camp," Garrett said. "You pulled off the trail when you heard the riders this morning. Smart. Those weren't my men." "Whose were they?" "Deal's. Roy Deal." Garrett said the name the way you'd say the name of a problem you'd been managing for a long time. "He took the Northwest Fork. He'll figure out the Box Canyon by tomorrow morning and backtrack. And when he does, he's going to be unhappy and moving fast. Which is why we don't have a lot of time to have this conversation." "What conversation?" Vivian said from the trees. Garrett looked toward her voice. He didn't try to locate her precisely. Just acknowledge the direction, the way you acknowledge a presence you're not trying to crowd. I've been working for Silas Crow for 9 years, he said. Before that, I worked for a man in Kansas named Durrell, who turned out to have a very similar understanding of the law. He paused. I found things. I found people. I recovered things that didn't belong to the people who had them, according to whoever was paying me. That's the job. And now? Elias said. And now I've been paid to find Mrs. Holloway and the documents she's carrying and return both to Denver. A pause. Return her alive, just to be precise. Crow needs her alive for the documentation to have the legal complications he wants to create. Dead, she's just a woman who ran off with papers. Alive, there are questions he can ask in court about provenance and theft. Elias said, You're telling us your employer's legal strategy. I'm telling you what it was, Garrett said. Past tense. The pine trees shifted in the late afternoon wind. The gray horse moved its weight from one foot to the other. Somewhere north, a bird made a sound that was almost a question. Why? Vivian said. She came out of the trees now, keeping Noah behind her, stopping at Elias's left shoulder. Her face had the same stillness it had held all day, but underneath it he could see her processing Garrett at high speed, sorting what she knew about him against what he was saying, looking for the seam. Garrett looked at her directly. Your father-in-law, he said. Something moved through her face that she didn't quite manage to contain. What about him? Thomas Holloway. He died in February of this year. You know that. I know that. You know it because your former husband wrote you a letter telling you about it. Garrett reached into his coat slowly, with the deliberate care of a man being careful around a loaded situation, and withdrew an envelope. He held it out at arm's length. You didn't know that before Thomas died, he wrote his own letter. To me. Nobody moved. He'd hired me 2 years prior, Garrett said, still holding the envelope out, to investigate the Carver Valley land transfers, before you found the documents yourself, before any of this. He was an old man who suspected something was wrong and didn't know who to trust, and hired a man whose job it was to find things. He set the envelope down on the ground and stepped back from it. He paid me for 6 months of work, and then Crow found out I was looking, and I stopped. I took the money, and I stopped. His voice was flat when he said this. No attempt to soften it. Thomas Holloway was 81 years old and sick, and he died knowing I'd quit on him. I've been thinking about that for 8 months. Vivian was looking at the envelope on the ground. Pick it up, Garrett said. It's his handwriting. You'll know it. She didn't move for a moment. Then she crossed to the envelope and picked it up without taking her eyes off Garrett. She opened it one-handed, keeping the other arm half extended, keeping herself between Garrett and the trees where Noah was. She read it. Elias watched her face while she read. He watched something happen to it that was not crying, and was not relief, and was not grief, but was some terrible combination of all three that hit the face of a person who discovers that someone they lost was trying to protect them and ran out of time. She folded the letter back. She held it against her chest for a second, and then she put it in her coat pocket. He found the original deed, she said. Not to Garrett, to herself. Then to Garrett. He found the Holloway original, before I did. He found it, and he gave it to me to keep safe, Garrett said. I've had it for 2 years. I kept it when I walked away from the investigation because I told myself it was collateral, that I'd use it when the time was right, that quitting wasn't the same as losing. He paused. I've been telling myself that for 2 years. He reached into his coat again, the same slow, visible motion, and produced a folded document, heavy paper, folded 3 times, the edges worn with age and handling. He held it out. Elias walked forward and took it. He unfolded it carefully and looked at it, and even to his non-legal eye, the thing had the specific quality of an original, the age of the ink, the texture of the paper, the notary's seal at the bottom that had the slightly uneven impression of a real stamp pressed by a real hand rather than a reproduction. He handed it to Vivian. She looked at it for longer than he had. She turned it over. She held it up to the remaining afternoon light and looked at the notary's seal from 2 inches away, and then lowered it and pressed her lips together in the tight, controlled expression of someone who is maintaining composure through sheer structural willpower. This is the one they couldn't replicate, she said. This is why the forgery was detectable. They didn't have the original to work from precisely because he... She stopped. Yes, Garrett said. A silence held over the trail. Noah came out of the trees. He walked to his mother's side and looked at Garrett with those gray eyes that had cataloged everyone they'd ever encountered, and he said, "Are you going to hurt us?" "No," Garrett said. "Were you going to? Before?" Garrett looked at the boy for a moment. "I was going to return you to Denver," he said. "I don't hurt women and I don't hurt children. But returning you to Denver under Crow's terms would have resulted in things that hurt you, so the distinction is thinner than I'd like." Noah considered this with the focused seriousness of someone evaluating an honest answer they weren't certain they liked. "Okay," he said. Garrett looked at Elias. "I need to know if you'll take it." "The deed. And my testimony. I can give a sworn deposition about Thomas Holloway hiring me, about what I found in 6 months of investigation, about why I stopped, about what Crow's organization knew I was doing and how they communicated the suggestion that I stop." He paused. "It's not enough on its own, but added to what she's carrying, it fills the gap," Vivian said quietly. "It fills the gap," Garrett confirmed. Elias looked at the man, looked at him with the careful attention he'd been giving terrain for 11 years, reading what was visible against what was underneath, looking for the soft ground, the false color, the place where the earth was not what it appeared. What he saw was a man who was tired, not physically, something older than physical, the tiredness of someone who has been making a particular accommodation with himself for long enough that the accommodation had become heavier than whatever it was keeping at bay. He'd seen that in the mirror, more mornings than he could count. "Crow will know you came to us," Elias said. "He'll know by tomorrow morning when Deal backtracks," Garrett said. "It doesn't matter. Once I hand this over, my position changes regardless. He'll come after you. He'll try." Something moved briefly through Garrett's face that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm not easy to find when I don't want to be found. I've spent 9 years proving that." Elias held out his hand. Garrett shook it. It wasn't a comfortable handshake. It wasn't two men who trusted each other. It was two men who understood each other's position and had decided that for the purposes of the current moment, that was enough. They moved within the hour, the four of them now. Garrett on his gray, Elias driving the cart, Vivian and Noah in the bed, heading northeast through the last of the Carver Creek Pass with more speed than Elias had been allowing himself, because the calculation had changed. Deal would backtrack by morning. Deal angry and fast on a direct trail was a different problem than Deal working through the pass behind them. The only answer to that problem was distance. Garrett rode ahead and slightly right, his natural position, the point position of someone who defaulted to being the eyes. He had the terrain knowledge of someone who'd been in this country a long time, and twice in the first hour he indicated route adjustments with a hand signal that Elias followed without discussion, and both times the adjustment made sense immediately when he saw the terrain ahead. They made the windbreak spring camp Elias had intended by just after dark, and this time Garrett built a small fire in a rock depression that broke the light below the sight line of the trail, a trick of long practice, and nobody commented on the expertise of it, because commenting on it would have required addressing what kind of work that expertise had been developed in service of, and they were past the point where that conversation would help anyone. Noah ate well. For the first time in what Elias understood was a long time. He ate, and then he sat near the fire with his knees pulled up, and he looked at Garrett with the steady, evaluating attention that he gave everything. And eventually he said, "You've been following us for 2 days, and you knew where we were the whole time." "Yes," Garrett said. "Why didn't you just come to us sooner?" Garrett looked at the fire. "I needed to make sure you were who I thought you were," he said, "that she was really who Thomas Holloway's letter described." He paused. "And I needed to make sure about him." He nodded at Elias. "I didn't know who he was when I first picked up your trail. A man traveling with a woman carrying that kind of evidence could be protection or could be Crow's way of getting close. I had to watch long enough to know." "And now you know?" Noah said. "Now I know." Noah looked at Elias, then back at Garrett. "He gave us his bread," he said, with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided this is the definitive information. "The first night. He didn't know us, and he gave us the last of his food." Garrett looked at Elias with an expression that had something human in it that his face hadn't shown before. "All right," he said. Vivian was sitting with the satchel on her lap, and she'd opened it for the first time since Elias had known her and was carefully, methodically, going through its contents by firelight. He could see the papers, folded, some sealed with wax, some wrapped in oilskin. And the careful, intimate way she handled each one told him everything about how long she'd been living with this weight. She lifted each piece, checked it, set it aside, lifted the next. Then she took Thomas Holloway's original deed, which Garrett had surrendered, and placed it in the center of the arrangement and looked at the whole collection for a long time. "It's complete," she said, to no one, to herself. "It's all here." Then she looked up, and there was something different in her eyes. Not relief, not quite, but the specific moment before relief. When a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time registers that they are no longer alone with it, and the weight doesn't go away, but the carrying of it changes. "I need to tell you something," she said. Elias looked at her. "The letters I sent to Nathaniel Cross. My attorney." She paused. "I sent 7 over 4 months. Through different post offices, different routes. He didn't respond to any of them." She looked at the papers in her lap. 3 days ago, before I reached Blackstone Ridge, I stopped in a town called Merritt's Crossing. There was a telegraph office." She paused. "I sent a telegraph to the federal land office in Denver, not to Cross, directly to the federal office." Elias said, "What did it say?" "I said I was in possession of original documentation pertaining to fraudulent land transfers in the Carver Valley region, and that I was attempting to reach Denver to file a federal case, and that I was being pursued by agents of Silas Crow." She folded her hands on top of the papers. "I asked them to confirm that the filing process was still open and that a federal judge was available to receive the case." "Did you get a response?" Yes, she said. 3 words. "Do not come." The fire cracked. A small piece of wood shifted and threw a brief light that made everyone's shadow jump. "Do not come," Elias repeated. "Do not come," Vivian said. Garrett said from across the fire. "Who sent the response?" "It was signed with the Federal Land Office seal, standard acknowledgement header." She paused. "But the person who sent the original telegraph on my behalf, the Merritt's Crossing operator, she was a woman I'd met briefly, and before I left, she caught me outside and told me that 2 men had come into her office 20 minutes after she sent it." Vivian's voice was steady, frighteningly steady. "They asked her what the message said. She said it was confidential. One of them showed her a document with Silas Crow's name on it that she said looked like an official authorization. She didn't tell them what I'd sent." A pause. "But it means Crow has someone inside the federal land office." The weight of this sat down on the camp like something physical. Someone inside the federal land office meant that the telegraph response, "Do not come," had come from Crow's man, not from any federal official who'd actually read her message. Or it had come from a federal official who was already in Crow's pocket. Either way, the courthouse in Denver was not the straightforward destination it had seemed 12 hours ago. "Cross," Garrett said slowly. "Nathaniel Cross. I know that name." "He's my attorney," Vivian said. "He came recommended by—" "I know him from a different context," Garrett said. He was looking at the fire with the expression of someone running something through their memory, checking it, finding what he needed. 2 years ago, during my investigation, there was a list of names Crow's attorney had on file, people who'd been approached, offered things. He paused. Cross was on the list. Vivian went completely still. "I don't know what he was offered," Garrett said. "I don't know if he accepted. The list was a list of approaches, not acceptances. But he's been unreachable for 6 weeks, Vivian said. Her voice had dropped. And every letter I sent him, I included information about where I was going and what route I was considering." She looked at Elias, and the full understanding of it was moving through her face like water moving through earth, finding every crack. "If he's Crow's, then they've known your plans from the beginning," Elias said. "Every plan I made, every route I considered." Her hands tightened on the satchel. "That's why they were always a step behind, not a step ahead. I kept changing my plans at the last minute because I didn't feel right about them. Not because I was smart, because I kept second-guessing myself. I almost went to Cross's Denver office directly. She stopped. "Noah and I would have walked through the front door." Noah was listening to all of this with the careful attention he gave everything, and his face had something in it that was not fear and was not anger, but was the specific expression of a child absorbing information that permanently revises their understanding of how the world works, which is a particular kind of loss that never fully comes back. Hey, Elias said to him. Noah looked at him. You didn't go through the front door, Elias said. You went to a saloon in Blackstone Ridge and you looked at a piece of bread. That's where you went. Noah held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, and something in his face settled without becoming less serious. So Cross is unreachable for a reason, Garrett said. And the federal land office has been compromised, or we have to assume it has. Which means Denver is still the destination, but the filing process is significantly more complicated than it was. There's a federal circuit judge, Elias said. Marcus Hale. He rides the Carver-Denver circuit twice a year. I've done survey work that crossed into jurisdictions he was adjudicating. Elias paused, choosing the word carefully. He's difficult. He's not corrupt. Those aren't the same thing as friendly or easy, but they're what matters. Where is he now? Vivian said. If he's on circuit, he could be anywhere from Dalton County to the Denver courthouse. There's a schedule the federal office posts, but the federal office is... I have the schedule, Garrett said. Everyone looked at him. I make it my business to know where federal judges are, he said, without explaining further, and nobody asked him to. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded broadsheet, a federal circuit schedule, and opened it and held it to the firelight. His eyes moved down it. Hale was in Dalton County on the 14th. It's the 19th now. He traced the schedule with one finger. If he kept to time, he's either still in Dalton or he's begun moving toward the Denver courthouse. Between them is 4 days by stage, Elias said. 3 for a judge with a federal relay horse. So he could be anywhere on a 4-day road right now. Or in Denver already. Or delayed in Dalton. The uncertainty of it sat between them. 3 possible locations for the one man who could receive and act on the filing without going through the compromised land office. There's a telegraph in Carlton, Elias said. Half a day northeast of here. I've stopped there before. The operator there is a man named Birch. He's been running that office for 15 years. I can vouch for him personally. He paused. If we reach Carlton by midday tomorrow, I can telegraph the Dalton County Courthouse directly and ask for Hale's current location without going through the federal land office. And if Crow has someone watching Carlton's telegraph office, Vivian said, then we'll have a few hours from the time the telegraph is sent before they can respond to it, Elias said, which is a few hours more than we have standing here. Garrett folded the schedule and put it back in his saddlebag. There's another problem, he said. He said it the way he said most things, flat, direct, without preparation. And that flatness had the effect of making everything he said feel heavier than if he'd had the decency to soften it first. Deal is going to come out of that box canyon angrier and faster than I'd like, he said. He's going to figure out I didn't return to Crow's people, and he's going to add my name to the problem he's solving. Which means we're not just being followed by a man who wants the documents. We're being followed by a man who now has a personal score to settle and doesn't need instructions about how hard to push. He looked at Elias. I know how Deal operates. When he gets like this, he doesn't wait for permission. How far behind do you estimate he is? If he turned around at first light and moved hard, we have maybe 6 hours on him, maybe less. Elias looked at the fire and did the arithmetic. Carlton was half a day northeast, 6 hours. Possibly less. They'd have to move before dawn and move without stopping, which meant driving the cart in the dark on a trail he knew reasonably, but not perfectly, with a horse that had already put in a hard day, and whatever rest they got between now and before first light would have to be enough. He looked at Vivian. She was looking back at him with the same expression she'd had since the beginning of this, that calculating, measuring, dignified look, except underneath it now was something he hadn't seen before, not fear. Exhaustion had stripped something away from the composure she'd been maintaining, and what was underneath was not weakness, but a very specific kind of human rawness. The look of someone who has been holding something up with both hands for a very long time and is beginning to feel it in their arms. Sleep while you can, he said. We move at 3. She nodded. She looked at Noah, who had already pulled the wool blanket around himself and was sitting with his back against the cartwheel, eyes half closed, the animal practicality of a child who sleeps when sleep is available because he's learned it isn't always. 3 hours, she said. 3 hours, Elias confirmed. She looked at Garrett. Some complicated negotiation happened in her expression. She had trusted the wrong person before. She'd built 14 months of careful planning around an attorney who may have been selling her out the whole time. She was sitting by a fire with a man who had been paid to hunt her and had changed his mind. None of that was safe. None of it was the kind of clean, clear situation that allows for easy decisions. Thank you, she said to Garrett, for the deed, for Thomas's letter. Garrett looked into the fire. Don't thank me, he said. I kept it for 2 years. I should have come to you sooner. Why didn't you? I was quiet for a moment. Because coming to you meant ending my employment, he said. And ending my employment with Crow meant becoming someone Crow needed to find, and I'm very good at finding people, which means I know exactly how that ends. He paused. I'd been telling myself there'd be a better moment, a safer moment, a moment when the weight of it was just right. His jaw tightened. Thomas Holloway died waiting for me to find that moment. The fire popped. Smoke moved sideways in a small wind. The right moment was 2 years ago, Vivian said. Not harshly, just plainly, the way she said most things. Yes, Garrett said. It was. Nobody said anything else for a while. Elias slept in 90-minute fragments, the way he'd trained himself to on long survey expeditions. Enough to function, not enough to fall into the deep sleep that made you slow. He woke at 2:30 by his internal clock, which had been reliable for 20 years, and lay still for a moment looking at the sky above the tree line, where the stars had moved their prescribed distance and the pre-dawn cold had settled into the ground. He sat up. Garrett was awake. Had been awake, probably. He was sitting on the other side of the dead fire with his back against a pine and his arms folded, and when Elias moved, he looked over with the alertness of someone who had not been sleeping. Anything? Elias said quietly. Nothing, but I want to move. Elias woke Vivian with a hand on her shoulder, and she came awake immediately, eyes open, no disorientation, which told him everything about the quality of sleep she'd been getting for the past 14 months. She woke Noah with more gentleness, murmuring to him, and Noah surfaced slowly and blinked and pulled his blanket tighter, and Elias gave him the last of the hardtack, and the boy ate it in the dark without complaint. They packed in near silence, the specific practiced silence of people who understood that sound carried in cold air before dawn. Garrett saddled his gray. Elias hitched the gelding, who was less happy about it at 3 a.m. than he usually was, and expressed this through a quality of very loud nostril breathing that Elias managed by talking to him quietly and meaning it. They were on the trail by 3:10. The dark was near complete under the tree cover, and Elias drove mostly by feel and by the pale line of the trail that was visible between the darker shapes of the pines on either side. Garrett rode ahead at a distance where he could scout but still be heard if he had to signal. Noah slept again almost immediately, wedged between Elias and the satchel that Vivian had kept in her lap, and Vivian sat beside Elias in the dark, not sleeping, watching the trail ahead with those gray eyes that gathered what light existed. For a long time neither of them spoke. The horse moved, the wheels turned. The cold air moved through the pines and made a sound like something breathing. Then Vivian said quietly, "Your daughter, what was her name?" He didn't answer immediately. "May," he said. "How old?" "4." He paused. "Almost 5." Vivian was quiet for a moment. What was she like? Nobody had asked him that in years. People asked how old was she, and I'm sorry. And then they looked for the way out of the conversation, which he'd always understood because grief was uncomfortable to be near, and he'd never blamed anyone for it. Vivian had asked what she was like. He thought about it with the specific care you give a question that deserves a real answer. Loud, he said. She was louder than seemed possible for the size of her. She had opinions about everything and no volume control. He paused. She used to follow me when I was working in the yard and ask why about every single thing I did. Not being a pest about it, she actually wanted to know. Why are you using that nail and not the other nail? Why does the wood need to dry before you cut it? Why? He paused again. I never got tired of it. No, Vivian said. You wouldn't. The trail bent northeast and opened slightly, giving them a strip of sky between the pines and a little more starlight, and in that light he could see her profile, and she was looking ahead, but her expression had that quality of someone fully present to what they're hearing. Noah does that, she said. The questions. He was worse when he was smaller. A pause. We were in a town for 3 months, Alderton, middle of last year, and he started asking why we couldn't stay. Every day. Why can't we stay? Why do we have to leave? Why does the man want the papers? Why can't we just give them to him, and then we'd be safe? Her voice was even. I kept telling him it wasn't that simple. He kept asking why it wasn't that simple. A pause. He stopped asking eventually. Because he figured it out, or because he stopped believing you'd answer? She was quiet for a moment. Both, she said. The trail narrowed again and they rode in silence, and Elias thought about a 7-year-old boy who had learned to stop asking certain questions. And he thought about the imprecise and costly education that teaches children that some questions have no satisfying answers, and he thought about Vivian carrying that alongside everything else for 14 months. Not just the weight of the documents and the pursuit, but the weight of watching her son understand that the world was smaller and harder than it should have been for him at his age. Around 5 in the morning, Garrett appeared out of the darkness ahead, walking his horse back towards them at a pace that made Elias pull the gelding up before Garrett said anything. Trail forks 200 yards ahead, Garrett said, keeping his voice low. Left fork goes to Carlton, as planned. Right fork goes to a settlement called Brixton, smaller, a stage relay station. But there are boot prints on the right fork. He paused. Fresh. From the northeast, heading west. Someone came from Brixton direction and turned onto the left fork toward Carlton, maybe 2 hours ago. How many? 2. Could be ordinary travelers. Could be someone Crow sent ahead to watch the Carlton telegraph office. He looked at Elias. You said you know the operator in Carlton. Birch? Yes. Is there anyone you know in Brixton? Elias thought. Brixton. The stage relay station. He'd passed through it once, 3 years ago, on a survey run. The relay station manager had been a woman, middle-aged, who'd given him coffee and told him the southeast road was washed out in a tone that suggested she felt personally responsible for the road's behavior. He couldn't remember her name. Not well enough to rely on, he said. Then Carlton, Garrett said. But we go wide of the main trail on approach, come in from the north end rather than the south. If someone's watching the telegraph office from the south, they won't see us arrive. Elias looked at the sky. The darkness was beginning to thin at the very edges. Not light yet, but the earliest suggestion that light was somewhere in the plan for today. How long to Carlton from here if we move? He said. 2 hours, moving steady. They would arrive around 7. Birch opened the telegraph office at 7:30. 30 minutes waiting, at minimum, before they could send anything. And 30 minutes was the kind of gap that had been costing people everything in this particular story. Go wide, Elias said. North approach. They moved. The last 2 miles into Carlton were through open scrub country north of the tree line, and the dawn came up fully during those 2 miles. First gray, then pink, then the hard clear gold of a summer morning that showed everything and hid nothing. They were visible on the open ground to anyone watching from the right direction, which meant they moved fast and didn't stop, the horse at a pace that was just below the one that would have tired it, and Garrett out wide on the right flank watching the approach to the town. Carlton appeared ahead of them as a collection of low structures and a water tower, and the telegraph office was on the north side of the main street, which made the north approach almost exactly what they needed. They came into town from a direction that nobody watching the south end would see, tied the horse and the gray at the north end of the livery, and Elias left Vivian and Noah with Garrett and walked to the telegraph office. Birch was already inside. He'd come in early, the way men who love their work come in early, and when Elias pushed open the door, he looked up from behind his equipment with the recognition that comes from a man seeing someone he hasn't seen in 3 years and filing them immediately back into their correct category. Mercer, he said. Land survey business? Different business, Elias said. He closed the door behind him and lowered his voice and said, I need to telegraph the Dalton County Courthouse, and I need it done quietly. Not through any federal routing that might get flagged. Direct line to Dalton, courthouse address only, for the attention of Judge Marcus Hale's clerk. Birch looked at him for a moment. That's specific, he said. It is. Trouble? Some. Birch looked at him for another moment with the look of a man deciding something, and then he turned to his equipment. What's the message? Elias thought about it. Short, specific. Nothing that would mean anything to someone who intercepted it, except the 2 people it was intended for. Federal filing. Original materials. Seeking receiving judge, Mercer, Carlton office, this morning. Birch wrote it. Hale's clerk is a man named Devers. Competent. If Hale is in Dalton, Devers will have a response back to you inside 2 hours. And if Hale has already left for Denver, Devers will know where he is on the circuit. He tracks the judge's whereabouts. Birch was already keying the telegraph. the rapid, practiced sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Wait outside. I'll come find you when it comes back." Elias went back outside into the morning. He found Vivian and Noah and Garrett at the north end of the livery, the horse drinking at the trough. Noah sitting on a fence rail with his feet hanging. Elias reported what he'd done, leaving out nothing. Vivian said, 2 hours. Approximately. And if someone in Carlton is watching for us, then we've already been seen coming in from the north, Elias said, which means we've already committed to this. Sitting somewhere else wondering doesn't change that. She absorbed this, nodded. Noah said from the fence rail without looking up from something he was examining in his hands, a piece of interesting rock from the shape of it. When we get to the judge, will it be over? Getting to the judge is the beginning, Vivian said, not the end. But the running part, Noah said. Will the running part be over? Elias looked at the boy and at Vivian and at the morning that was already heating up around them. That's what we're trying to make happen, he said. Noah turned the rock over in his hands. Okay, he said, in the tone that meant he was filing the answer in the category of things that weren't satisfying but were honest, and he was making peace with the difference. They waited. 40 minutes in, a man came around the corner of the livery from the direction of the main street. He was young, moving fast without running, and when he spotted Elias, he came directly toward him, which meant Birch had described who to look for. He stopped in front of Elias and held out a slip of paper. Elias read it, then he read it again. He looked up at Vivian. Hale left Dalton 2 days ago, he said. He's already in Denver. His clerk telegraphed ahead. Hale will be at the Denver courthouse as of this morning. He paused. But there's something else. He looked at the slip of paper again. The clerk added a note. He says that 2 days before Hale left Dalton, a man came to the courthouse claiming to hold original land deeds for the Carver Valley case and requesting to file before a federal judge. He looked at Vivian. The man's name was Nathaniel Cross. Vivian's face did something complicated and fast. Cross was in Dalton, she said. Was, Elias said. The clerk says Hale reviewed Cross's materials and declined to open the case. The materials Cross presented were, the clerk's word is incomplete. Hale sent him back to Denver to obtain the originals. He folded the slip of paper, which means Cross either never had the originals or he handed them to someone who didn't give them to Hale, or he went to Hale without me, Vivian said. Her voice had a new quality. Without the documents I have, he tried to file without the originals. She was very still. Which means either he's been working against me from the beginning and tried to close the case with incomplete evidence to make it disappear, or... She stopped. Or he's been trying to help you and didn't have everything he needed, Garrett said. I don't know which, she said. I don't know if I can trust him. You don't have to trust him, Elias said. You have everything. You have the originals he didn't have. You have Thomas Holloway's deed. You have Garrett's testimony. You have everything Hale told Cross was missing. He held her gaze. We go to Denver, directly to Hale. Not through Cross, not through the land office, directly. And if Crow gets to Hale first? Ilias thought about the man on the circuit bench who had the reputation for being difficult in a way that was distinct from being corrupt. And he thought about the specific kind of frontier judge who had managed to stay uncorrupted long enough to build that reputation and what that required. Then Hale has probably already told him no, he said, and we walk in after. Vivian looked at him. Then she looked at Noah on the fence rail, who had heard all of it and was watching her with those gray eyes, waiting. She picked up the leather satchel. Denver, she said. The road to Denver was the fastest they'd moved since leaving Blackstone Ridge, and the fastest was still not fast enough. Garrett knew a freight route that cut 16 miles off the standard trail, not comfortable, not designed for a cart with a questionable rear axle, but passable, and more importantly, not a road that appeared on any public route map, which meant it was not a road that Roy Deal, backtracking angry from a box canyon, would think to check first. They took it without discussion. The cart lurched and shuddered on the rough ground, and Elias drove it with both hands and all his attention and said nothing about the axle, which was developing a sound he didn't like. Noah rode in the cart bed with his back against the side panel and his arms folded over his knees, and he slept in the lurching, difficult way of a child whose body has simply run out of reserves, dropping into sleep and jolting awake and dropping back again, his head bouncing against the panel in a way that should have kept him awake but didn't. Vivian sat beside Elias on the driver's bench. She had the satchel between her feet and her hands in her lap, and she watched the terrain ahead with the expression of someone who has stopped trying to anticipate the next problem and has decided to deal with each one as it arrives. Garrett rode flanking, switching sides every 30 minutes with the practiced regularity of someone who had done protective work long enough that it had become structural rather than conscious. They didn't stop for midday. They ate on the move. What was left of the dried meat, the last of the hardtack. And the horse drank at a creek crossing and kept going, and nobody complained about any of it, which was one of those small things that Elias noticed and filed under the category of people who have their priorities correctly ordered. Around mid-afternoon, Garrett came alongside the cart and said, "I want to tell you something about Deal." Elias said, "Go ahead." "He's not going to stop at the edge of Denver," Garrett said. "Some men, you get into a populated area, into a city, and they pull back. They don't like witnesses. They don't like the complications." He paused. "Deal isn't that kind of man. He's the kind who gets more reckless as he gets more frustrated. And he's been frustrated since the saloon." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that getting to the courthouse doesn't end it. Not for him." Garrett looked ahead at the road. "He'll wait outside. He'll wait for you to come out. He'll wait for the judge to be done and the documents to be filed in the moment when you think it's over and your attention drops." Vivian said, "Then what do we do?" "We get to Hale first," Garrett said, "and we ask for protection, federal jurisdiction. Once this case is filed and the judge acknowledges the evidence, there's a legal framework that makes touching any of you a federal matter." He paused. "It doesn't make you invisible, but it changes the calculation for anyone who's thinking about next steps." "Does it change the calculation for Deal?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Less than I'd like," he said, and moved back out to his flanking position. They reached the outskirts of Denver as the afternoon light was going flat and orange in the west. Denver was bigger than Blackstone Ridge, in the way that a river is bigger than a creek. Not just quantity, but character, a different kind of noise and density and movement. The particular energy of a place where money and ambition and rough frontier necessity were all operating at the same time in the same space. The federal courthouse was on the east side of the business district, a two-story brick building that looked more permanent than anything around it, which was probably the intention. Elias stopped the cart 2 streets away and looked at Garrett. "Cross," Elias said. "You said he might have been trying to help." "I said it was possible." "Is it worth finding out before we walk into that courthouse?" Garrett thought about it. "His office is on Clement Street, 3 blocks south." He looked at Vivian. "Your call." Vivian had been quiet for the last hour of writing, that particular quiet that wasn't emptiness but was a person running calculations that had gotten too complex for conversation. She looked at the courthouse building visible down the cross street, and then she said, "I want to talk to him, but not before we talk to Hale. If Cross is compromised and he knows we're here, we lose whatever advantage we have. If he's not compromised, he can wait 20 minutes. "Agreed," Elias said. They left the cart and the horse with Garrett at the livery 2 streets over. Garrett's call, and a correct one, because arriving at a federal courthouse in a battered survey cart with a questionable axle was not the entrance that commanded the serious attention they needed. They walked. Elias carried nothing except what he normally carried. Vivian carried the satchel pressed to her side, same as always, except that now there was more in it than there had been. The weight of Thomas Holloway's original deed added to everything she'd been carrying for 14 months, and she walked with her chin at that particular angle that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with refusal. Noah walked between them. He'd been quiet since waking from his cart bed sleep, processing things at the depth that only children manage, absorbing information through all available channels simultaneously, feeling the emotional weather of the adults around him with the specific sensitivity of a child who has been dependent on reading adult emotional weather for his survival. He took Elias's hand at the corner of the courthouse block, just reached up and took it, without looking at him, without saying anything. The same unconscious motion as leaning against his mother's arm in the saloon, the body finding its orientation by touch. Elias closed his hand around the boys without looking down, and they walked to the courthouse. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with ink on his fingers and the overwhelmed expression of someone managing more paper than was reasonable, and he looked up at Elias with the preliminary expression of someone about to say the judge is unavailable as a reflex before Elias had even opened his mouth. "Federal case filing," Elias said. "Original documentation. Judge Hale was expecting materials from a previous filer. We have the originals he indicated were missing. My name is Elias Mercer, federal survey contractor, and this is Vivian Holloway, the originating party. He put his federal requisition badge on the desk. I'd like you to tell Judge Hale we're here. Now, if possible. The clerk looked at the badge, looked at Vivian, looked at Noah, and then looked back at Elias with an expression that had recalibrated from reflex to something more attentive. "One moment," he said. He disappeared through a door. They stood in the entry hall. The building smelled like wood polish and old paper and whatever cleaning compound the federal government had decided represented institutional seriousness. Noah looked at the ceiling, which was higher than anything he'd been under recently, and something about the height of it seemed to settle him slightly, the way unusual things can anchor a child in a moment. "What if he says no?" Noah said. "Not scared, practical." "He won't say no before he looks at what we have," Vivian said. "What if he looks at it and then says no?" Vivian said, "Then we find a different judge." "Are there other judges?" "There are always other judges," Elias said. "The law isn't one person. That's the point of it." Noah considered this architectural reassurance and seemed to find it acceptable. The clerk came back. "Judge Hale will see you," he said, with a slight shift in his manner that suggested the judge's response to the message had been something other than routine. "If you'll follow me." Judge Marcus Hale's office was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway that smelled like the same wood polish but more concentrated, and the judge himself was standing when they came in rather than sitting, which was not what Elias had expected. He was 60 or so, tall, with white hair cut short, and a face that had the specific kind of leanness that comes from decades of making decisions that people didn't like and having to live with the making of them. His eyes were the color of creek water in winter, cold, clear, and not particularly welcoming. He looked at Vivian first, then at Elias, then, briefly, at Noah, and something moved through his expression at the sight of the boy that he didn't fully manage to suppress. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I received your filing through Mr. Cross 17 days ago." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Sit down." They sat. Hale remained standing, which Elias read as a power position and didn't comment on. "Cross presented me with copies," Hale said. "Certified copies," he claimed, "of land transfer documents relating to the Carver Valley region and one Silas Crow." He moved to his desk and opened a folder. "I reviewed them. The copies were, technically, in order. But they were copies. I asked Cross for the originals. He told me the originals were in a secure location and he would produce them." He paused. "That was 17 days ago." "He hasn't produced them," Vivian said. "He has not." Hale looked at her. "I sent him a notice of extension 10 days ago. I sent a second notice 5 days ago. This morning I sent a notice of case dismissal for failure to produce original documentation." His voice was level, the voice of a man stating facts with the particular care of someone who is aware that how you state facts is itself a legal act, which means that as of this morning, the Carver Valley case is, on paper, closed. The silence that followed had a specific shape to it, the shape of everything they'd survived in the past 4 days meeting a closed door, and for a moment the weight of it was enormous. Then Vivian set the leather satchel on Hale's desk. "These are the originals," she said. She opened the satchel and began removing the contents, placing each piece on the desk with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who has been protecting these things with her life and is now transferring that protection to the one context where it might actually mean something. The land deeds, 11 of them. The sworn depositions, 4 of them. The notary's letter. The authenticated records. Thomas Holloway's original deed, the one Garrett had carried for 2 years. She laid them out in order, and the order was not random. It told a story, piece by piece, the way a careful person arranges evidence so that the logic of it is visible before you read a single word. Hale looked at the arrangement on his desk. He pulled Thomas Holloway's deed toward him and looked at it for 30 seconds without speaking, turning it over, examining the notary seal. Then he picked up one of the transfer documents and held it next to the deed and looked at both of them in the light from the window. "The ink is different," he said. "Yes," Vivian said. "On the transfer, the ink in the signature block is a different age than the body of the document." "Yes, the body of the document is original. The signatures were added later. A different pen, different ink compound. The notary in Millard County who certified the originals confirmed it before she paused, before he became unavailable." Hale set the documents down. He looked at Vivian the way he'd been looking at the documents. with the focused attention of someone who is reading for what's underneath. "You've had these for 14 months, he said. "Yes." "You've been carrying them personally?" "Yes." "And the men following you are still behind us," Elias said. "We have time, but not a great deal of it." Hale looked at Elias. "Your involvement in this?" "I met Mrs. Holloway 4 days ago," Elias said. "Federal survey contractor. I have a requisition badge on your clerk's desk. I transported her and her son from Blackstone Ridge." He paused. "I'd like to give a statement attesting to the condition of the documents during transport, if that's useful." "It may be." Hale looked at Noah. "And the boy?" "My son," Vivian said. "Noah Holloway. His name appears on one of the fraudulent transfer documents. He was 6 when the transfer was recorded." Something hardened in Hale's face that was not a dramatic expression, but was the expression of someone who has just received a specific category of information that they find personally unacceptable. "His name," he said, "as a minor party to the transfer, to create a legal complication if he ever tried to claim the property." Hale looked at Noah for a moment. Noah looked back at him with the steady, gray-eyed attention that he gave everything, and did not look away. And Hale, after a moment, appeared to find something in this that affected him. "The case dismissal I issued this morning," Hale said. He pulled a piece of paper from the folder and looked at it. "Is not yet entered into the official record. It was drafted this morning, pending the afternoon filing session." He set the paper down. "Which hasn't occurred yet." Vivian understood immediately. "You can reverse it." "I can decline to enter it," Hale said, "if sufficient original documentation is presented to justify reopening review." He looked at the papers on his desk. "This?" He stopped. He touched the edge of Thomas Holloway's deed with one finger. "This is sufficient." He looked at Vivian. "I'm going to need your deponent signatures. I'm going to need a full chain of custody statement for every document on this desk. And I'm going to need—" He paused. "You said the Millard County notary is unavailable. What does unavailable mean?" "He disappeared," Vivian said, 3 weeks after certifying these documents. I don't know if he's alive." Hale absorbed this without visible reaction, which meant he was filing it in a category he already had. "I'm going to need a substitute authentication, a second notary, or a professional document examiner, someone who can confirm the ink analysis." He looked at the desk again. "But on the basis of what I can see here—" He paused, and the pause was the specific pause of a careful man choosing exact words. "I have enough to issue an emergency evidence preservation order, which means every document on this desk becomes a federal protected record as of this moment, and anyone attempting to access, remove, or destroy them is committing a federal offense." He looked at Vivian. "It doesn't close the case, it opens it. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," Vivian said. "Opening it means Crow will know within hours. His attorney will file a countermotion. There will be a hearing, possibly multiple hearings. It will take time." "I understand. You and the documents will need to remain available to the court, which means you cannot leave Denver, which means—" "I know what it means," Vivian said. "We've been running for 14 months. I don't want to run anymore." Hale looked at her for another moment. Then he went to the door and called for his clerk, and when the young man appeared, he said, "Get me the emergency evidence preservation forms. And find Alderman. I need a document witness." He turned back into the room. "This is going to take several hours. I need statements from each of you, written, signed." He looked at Noah. "Not the boy. But I'll need his mother to provide his statement." He gestured to the chairs. "Sit down, all of you. We're going to do this correctly." They sat. For the next 3 hours, Elias watched Vivian do the thing she'd been building toward for 14 months, and it was not what he'd imagined it would look like. He'd imagined something dramatic, emotion, confrontation, the release of everything she'd been carrying. What it actually looked like was a woman sitting at a table and answering questions with complete precision, producing documents when asked, explaining the chain of custody for each piece of paper with the careful detail of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times that she could deliver it without feeling it, while feeling all of it, simultaneously, somewhere below the surface. She made one mistake, transposing 2 dates in a chain of custody description, and caught it herself before anyone else did and corrected it without apology. "Just wait, that's wrong." It was the 14th, not the 16th, with the brisk self-correction of someone who cares more about accuracy than about looking infallible. Hale's clerk, Devers took the statements. Hale himself reviewed the documents and made notations and asked occasional questions that were sharp and specific. The questions of someone who had been doing this long enough to know exactly which details mattered and which were decoration. Noah sat on a chair against the wall and did not complain for 3 hours, which was extraordinary for a 7-year-old, and which Elias thought said everything about what this child had been doing with himself for the past 14 months. In the spaces when adults were handling adult business, and he was required to simply exist patiently and wait. At one point, in the second hour, Noah fell genuinely asleep in the chair, tipping sideways against the wall. And nobody commented on it, not even Hale, who paused when he saw it, and then simply continued with a slightly lower voice. Elias gave his own statement, a complete account of everything from the saloon in Blackstone Ridge forward, including Garrett. At the mention of Garrett, Hale looked up. "The tracker Crow hired came to your aid?" he said. "He brought the Thomas Holloway deed," Elias said, "and he's prepared to give a sworn deposition about his 9 years working for Crow. The approaches Crow made, the instructions given, the methods used." He paused. "He also has information about the man currently following us, Roy Deal, and about Crow's network in the Federal Land Office. His name, Calvin Garrett." Hale wrote it. "I'll want him here." "He's nearby," Elias said. "Get him," Hale said. "Today, if possible." His testimony goes directly to criminal conspiracy, which is a separate track from the civil land fraud. Both tracks can run simultaneously. He looked at Elias. "This is larger than land deeds, Mr. Mercer." "I know," Elias said. "I'm going to need to involve the federal marshal's office, which means there may be someone in the federal land office who is working for Crow," Elias said, "which means the federal marshal's office needs to be contacted directly, not through the land office." Hale looked at him with the specific expression of someone finding out that a problem they thought was a certain size is actually larger. "You know who?" "We don't have a name. We know the land office communication was compromised. Telegraph responses were being intercepted or originated from inside." Hale set down his pen. He looked at the wall for a moment, which was not a dramatic gesture. It was the look of a man recalculating. Then he said, "Marshal's office, direct contact, I'll handle that personally." He picked his pen back up. "Continue." When Elias finished his statement, he stood and stretched his back, which had been complaining for an hour, and went to find Garrett. Garrett was where he'd said he'd be, at the livery, with the horse and the gray, doing nothing in the particular accomplished manner of a man who knows how to wait without consuming energy. When Elias came in and told him the judge wanted him, Garrett unsaddled the gray with the methodical motion of a man who does things right, even when he's in a hurry, handed the reins to the stable boy, and walked out without saying anything else. On the way back to the courthouse, Garrett said, "Deal. What about him?" "I've been watching from the livery entrance. A man came through the main street 20 minutes ago on a bay horse, moving slow, looking." He paused. "It wasn't Deal, but it was someone I recognized from Crow's operation, a rider named Watts." "He saw you?" "I don't think so, but he's here, which means Deal is close." They walked faster. Inside the courthouse, Hale was still at his desk when they returned. He looked at Garrett with the same Winter Creek attention he'd given everything else and said, "Sit down." And Garrett sat. And for the next 45 minutes, Hale extracted from Garrett 9 years of accumulated information with the focused, unhurried efficiency of a man who has spent decades learning how to peel things apart. Garrett gave it completely. Elias had expected some hesitation, some calculation about what to admit and what to protect, but there was none. He gave names, dates, locations, instructions received, actions taken. He described the approaches to county recorders, to notary offices, to attorneys. He described the meeting at which Crow's lead attorney had laid out the Carver Valley land acquisition strategy, which Garrett had been present for as a security detail, and which he'd understood only in its implications, not its legal mechanics, but which he described in enough detail that Hale's pen moved quickly across the paper and didn't stop. At one point, Garrett said, "There's a name in the federal land office. I don't have it, but I know the approach was made through Crow's attorney, man named Fitch. And it went to someone in the Denver office who handled the Carver Valley regional filing specifically. If you can identify who that person is, you'll find the money." "How?" "Separate account. Land transactions produce paper. Crow's attorney is clean enough on the surface, but there's a parallel set of records that he keeps for internal purposes. Not at his Denver office. At a property Crow owns in Millard County. A ranch that's been empty for 2 years. Garrett gave the address. Hale wrote it. I've been in that building. I know what the records look like and where they're kept. Can you testify to what you've personally seen in those records? Yes. Hale looked at what he'd written. Mr. Garrett, he said, I want to be clear with you about your own situation. I know my situation, Garrett said. You've admitted to actions that… I know, Garrett said again, flat, not defensive. I'll deal with what comes from that. I'm not asking for anything in return for this. He paused. I'm saying it anyway. If that's worth something legally, I'll take it. If it isn't, the information is still true. Hale looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating a person downward and then upward within the space of 30 seconds. I'll note the voluntary nature of the disclosure, he said. That's all I can promise. That's all I asked for, Garrett said. Hale stood and gathered the statements and the documents and carried them to a locked cabinet that he opened with a key on a chain at his vest and placed everything inside and locked it and stood with the key in his hand for a moment. Emergency evidence preservation order is in effect as of now, he said. I'm issuing a subpoena for Silas Crow to appear at a preliminary hearing 1 week from today. He turned to face them. His attorney will fight the subpoena. He will file motions. He will attempt to have the case transferred to a different jurisdiction, likely one where he has more influence. I will deny the transfer. He will appeal the denial. I will hold the denial. His voice was even, describing bureaucratic warfare with the same tone he'd used for everything else. This will take months, possibly longer, Vivian said. But it's open. It's open, Hale said, and the evidence is in federal custody. Whatever Crow's people do in the next 48 hours, they cannot touch these documents. He looked at her. You've done your part, Mrs. Holloway. The law will do the rest, for whatever that's worth. It's worth something, Vivian said. Today, it's worth something. They were in the hallway outside Hale's office when Elias heard the front door of the courthouse open 2 floors below, and then a voice that carried up the stairwell. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the specific quality of someone who is angry and past the point of pretending otherwise. Roy Deal's voice. Elias put his hand on Vivian's arm and said quietly, "Stay here," and went to the top of the stairs. Below him, in the entry hall, Roy Deal was at the clerk's desk. He had not drawn anything. He was not, technically, doing anything that a man couldn't do in a federal courthouse. He was standing at a public desk and speaking to a public clerk, and the clerk was looking at him with the expression of someone who is trying to determine whether the situation they're in requires them to do something. Deal said, "I need to speak with whoever came in here within the last 3 hours, woman named Holloway. I'm here on behalf of her employer, Silas Crow. There's a matter of documents she's holding that belong to him." Elias came down the stairs. Deal looked up when he heard the footsteps. He registered Elias, and something moved through his jaw. "Surveyor," Deal said. "Mr. Deal," Elias said. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, 8 feet from the desk. "Whatever you've been told about the documents, they're not here." It was a lie, and Deal probably knew it was a lie, but the lie put him in a specific position. If he pushed, he was pushing in a federal courthouse without a legal basis for anything, and if someone was watching, which the clerk was, the situation created a record. "Where is she?" Deal said. "Not my concern right now," Elias said. He looked at the clerk. "Could you let Judge Hale know that a Mr. Deal has arrived in connection with the Crow matter?" The clerk, who had been watching this exchange with considerable attention, stood immediately and went through the inner door. Deal looked at Elias. The calculation in his face was visible. Pushing harder made things worse in this building, and he knew it, and the knowledge was making him angrier rather than more careful, which was the pattern Garrett had described. He was a man who got worse under pressure rather than better. "Crow will know you were involved," Deal said. "From the saloon. He knows your name." "I imagine so," Elias said. "That doesn't worry you." "It concerns me," Elias said. "Worrying about it wouldn't help anything." He held Deal's look evenly. "Go back to your employer and tell him the documents are in federal custody and the case is open. That's the information he needs." Something shifted in Deal's face. Not acceptance. The particular shift of a man receiving information that restructures the problem he thought he was solving. Then the inner door opened and Hale's clerk came out, followed by a man Elias didn't recognize, mid-40s, compact, wearing the specific kind of plain clothes that suggested a professional reluctance to be noticed, with a federal deputy's badge visible at his coat. And Deal looked at the badge and made the rapid, accurate calculation of someone who has operated around federal authority long enough to know when the environment has shifted against him. He left without saying anything else. The front door closed behind him. The deputy marshal looked at Elias. Judge Hale asked me to come down, said there might be someone needing to leave the building safely. He paused. Female party. Child. Second floor, Elias said. He went back upstairs. Vivian was where he'd left her, with Noah awake now beside her, and Garrett behind them at the window. Garrett had watched the street below throughout and said, when Elias came back, Deal had 2 men outside. They're gone now. That doesn't mean they went far. Marshall's downstairs, Elias said. Garrett nodded. He looked out the window one more time, the long, professional look of someone reading a street for what's underneath the ordinary surface of it, and said, his men will regroup. Crow's attorney will file before tomorrow morning. Whatever's going to move legally will move fast. He turned from the window. You should find somewhere to stay tonight that isn't obvious. Not a main hotel. I know a boarding house on the north side, Elias said. Woman named Clara Hewish runs it. I stayed there 2 years ago on a survey contract. She's not connected to anything in this situation. Good, Garrett said. He picked up his hat from the windowsill and held it in his hands for a moment, looking at Vivian and Noah, and something in his face did what it had done by the fire the previous night. That brief human opening, the expression of a man who has been working at a certain remove from consequence for a long time and has come close enough now to feel it. I need to move on, he said. The deposition I gave Hale today, Crow will have access to it through his attorney within 48 hours, which means Crow will know exactly what I said and who I said it to. He paused. I need to be somewhere other than Denver. Vivian said, will you be safe? Garrett considered this honestly. I'll be in a better position than I would be if I'd kept the deed, he said. That's about what I can say for certain. He looked at Noah. You did well, kid. The whole way. Noah looked at him with those steady gray eyes. You too, he said, with the simple directness of a child who has decided a person has earned their assessment. Something moved through Garrett's face that was brief and not repeated, and he put his hat on and left. They heard him go down the stairs and through the front door, and then the street outside received him, and he was gone, the gray horse carrying him in whatever direction a man goes when he has finally done the thing he should have done 2 years ago and has to live with the time it took him to get there. The deputy marshal escorted them from the courthouse through a side entrance, not the main door where Deal had been, and through an alley that came out on a parallel street. It was evening now, the light going copper and long on the Denver streets, and the city was doing what cities do in the evening, filling with people heading home or heading out, the particular density of human movement that makes any individual in it harder to track. They walked to Clara Hewish's boarding house on the north side, Elias carrying Noah for the last 2 blocks because the boy's legs had finally given out under him in the specific way of children who have exceeded their operational limit, falling asleep on Elias's shoulder with the completeness of someone who has decided this is now a safe enough place to stop holding themselves together. The weight of him was different from what Elias had expected. Not heavier, just specific. A specific weight, a specific warmth, the exact feeling of a child who has trusted you enough to go to sleep on you. Clara Hewish was a practical woman in her 50s who had been taking in travelers for 20 years and had long since stopped finding unusual circumstances unusual. She looked at the group of them. Elias carrying a sleeping child, Vivian with her leather satchel, a deputy marshal walking them in. And she said, 2 rooms? 2 rooms, Elias said. Supper's in an hour. Thank you, Clara. She showed them upstairs without asking a single question, which was the particular grace of a woman who understood that the questions that mattered would be answered by how people behaved in her house and not by what they said in the hallway. Elias put Noah down on the bed in Vivian's room and the boy didn't wake, just shifted and settled into the mattress with the absorption of someone going somewhere deep, and Vivian stood at the foot of the bed and looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat on the chair beside the bed and put the leather satchel on her lap, and she held it, and her hands were shaking. Not badly. Not the shaking of collapse. The shaking of a person who has been holding something at the necessary tension for a very long time, and has, in this moment, found that the necessity is slightly less acute than it was this morning, and the body has decided to acknowledge this in the only way it knows. It's filed, Elias said from the doorway. It's filed, she said. He can't unfiled it. She looked at her hands. Then she set the satchel on the floor beside the chair. The first time she'd put it down since Elias had known her that wasn't operationally necessary. And she sat back and let her shoulders drop from the position they'd been in for what he suspected was 14 months. My father used to say, she said, and then she stopped. She looked at the window. He used to say the hardest part wasn't starting a hard thing. It was the moment when it was out of your hands and you had to just let the world do what it did with it. Is that how this feels? Elias said. She thought about it honestly. Part of it, she said. The other part feels like, she looked at Noah, like I don't know what comes next. And I've spent 14 months knowing exactly what came next because the next thing was always this. Getting here. And now this is done and I don't… She paused. I don't know what we do tomorrow. Elias leaned against the doorframe. The boarding house was quiet around them, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary place. Someone moving in a room down the hall, the clatter from the kitchen below where supper was being assembled. Tomorrow, he said, we have breakfast. And then we wait for Crow's attorney to file his motion, which Hale will deny. And then we wait for the hearing to be scheduled. He paused. That's tomorrow. She looked at him. And the day after that, she said. The day after that, we have breakfast again, he said, and we see what the day needs. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you have a survey contract. You've missed 3 days of it already. I sent a telegraph from Carlton this morning, he said. Told them I'd be delayed on account of a federal matter, which is true. They'll want you back. They'll wait, he said. Survey work doesn't expire. She looked at him with that measuring look, and this time what was underneath it was not the calculation of whether he could be trusted. She was past that. But something else, the more complicated and more vulnerable assessment of a person deciding what they feel about the fact that someone has stayed. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. You've already done… I know, he said again, and the patience in his voice was the same patience it had been from the beginning. The patience that was not performance, but was the actual quality of a man who had spent 11 years alone with a great deal of time to think about what mattered and had arrived at some conclusions. She looked at her hands. They'd stopped shaking. Elias, she said. The bread. That first night. She paused. I want you to know. I knew you hadn't finished it, that I knew it wasn't leftover. I knew you left it on purpose. She looked at him. I let Noah take it anyway because we needed it, but I want you to know I wasn't fooled. He looked at her. I know you weren't, he said. I wasn't trying to fool you. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Noah, sleeping on the bed, and something in her expression was the closest thing to rest that Elias had seen on her face in 4 days. Thank you, she said. Not for the bread specifically. Not for any specific thing. You're welcome, he said, and meant it the same way. Downstairs, the supper bell rang. The supper bell rang twice before anyone moved. Clara Howish ran her dining table the way she ran everything else, with the blunt practicality of someone who had learned that the most useful thing you could offer a tired person was a hot meal and no questions. She set 4 places without being asked, which meant she'd counted them coming up the stairs and adjusted without comment. And when Elias came down carrying Noah, who had woken groggy and warm from the deep sleep and hadn't fully reattached to the world yet, she simply pointed at the chair nearest the kitchen and said, "That one's got the most cushion? For the boy." Noah sat in the cushioned chair and ate with the focused, quiet attention of someone whose body had decided that food was the priority and conversation could wait. Vivian ate beside him. Elias ate across from them, and for a while the only sounds at the table were the ordinary sounds of a meal in a warm room. Forks on plates, the small settling sounds of a house in the evening, the distant street noise of Denver doing what Denver did. It was the first meal any of them had eaten sitting down at a proper table in 4 days, and the particularity of that normalcy was strange, in a way that was hard to articulate and that none of them tried to. Clara brought coffee and disappeared back into the kitchen, and Noah, who had cleaned his plate with thoroughness, sat back in the cushioned chair and looked at the ceiling in the specific way of children who are processing something that's too big for their vocabulary. "Are we safe here?" he said. To the ceiling. "For tonight," Elias said. "What about tomorrow?" "Tomorrow is safer than today was," Vivian said. "Today was safer than yesterday. That's the direction we're moving. Noah brought his eyes down from the ceiling and looked at her. In a straight line? Not exactly straight, she said, but in a direction. He seemed to find this acceptable. He picked up his coffee cup. Clara had given him coffee, diluted heavily with milk and sugar, in the manner of a woman who had fed many children over many years and understood that the ritual of a coffee cup was sometimes as important as what was in it. And he held it with both hands and drank from it with a dignity that was slightly undercut by the fact that he left a milk mustache that he didn't notice. Elias looked at him and felt something that he had not felt in 11 years, in a way that was not painful, had never felt in those 11 years without pain attached to it, because everything that reminded him of May reminded him of losing May, and that was the trap of grief, the way it colonized the things that should have been comfort. But looking at Noah with his milk mustache and his dignified coffee cup, and his careful, serious questions about the direction of safety, it was not painful. It was something else, something adjacent to painful but different in the way that scar tissue is different from a wound. Still marked, still there, but no longer open. He didn't examine it closely. He finished his coffee and said he was going to check the street before turning in, which was true, and also gave him a moment outside in the evening air, which he needed. Denver at night was not quiet, but it had a quality of settled noise, the noise of a place that had organized itself into a certain routine and was following that routine. He stood on the boarding house step and looked both ways down the street and saw nothing that concerned him. Ordinary foot traffic, a cart heading east, the warm lamplight from the buildings on either side. No bay horse, no men standing in doorways at an angle that meant they were watching rather than resting. I thought about Deal. Deal had left the courthouse, and his men had gone with him, and Garrett had said they'd regroup. That was true. But regrouping now meant different things than it had meant 4 days ago. 4 days ago, recovering the documents and silencing Vivian Holloway was a manageable problem. Now the documents were in federal custody, the case was open, and Judge Hale had the specific quality of a man who did not quietly unsee things once he'd seen them. The problem had become considerably larger. Crow was smart enough to know that. Smart enough to know that whatever came next was legal maneuvering, not physical recovery, which meant Deal's usefulness in Denver had expired, and men like Crow didn't keep paying for expired usefulness. Elias thought, Deal is probably already on a horse going back to wherever Crow needed him. And then he thought, or Crow told him to do something stupid because Crow is angry, and anger makes men give bad instructions. He'd seen both outcomes in his life and could not be certain which one was in play tonight, so he stayed on the step for 10 minutes and watched the street and decided that tonight was manageable. Tomorrow was a different question. He went back inside. Vivian was helping Clara clear the table, which she'd started doing without being asked, and Clara was accepting the help without making a thing of it, which Elias thought said something good about both of them. Noah was still in the cushioned chair, genuinely asleep now, the coffee cup tipped slightly in his relaxed hands. Elias gently took the cup from him. Vivian looked over from the table. He looked back at her. She nodded slightly, which meant thank you, and also meant I see you, and also meant something else that neither of them said, which was that this small domestic moment, a sleeping child, a reclaimed cup, the ordinary safety of a warm room, was the kind of thing that had been theoretically possible for 14 months and had not been available, and was available now, fragile and real, and they were both aware of its fragility and choosing, for this moment, to receive it anyway. The morning came with the particular clarity of a summer day in Denver that had decided to be honest about itself. Bright and already warm before 8 o'clock, the kind of morning that makes everything look like it might be all right even before you've had time to check. Elias was up at 6, old habit. He'd slept 4 solid hours, which was more than he'd expected and enough to function properly. And he lay in the boarding house bed for 10 minutes before rising, which was unusual for him, because he spent those 10 minutes not thinking about the day's tasks, but simply lying still in a space that was warm and quiet and not requiring anything of him. It had been a long time since a space had done that. He found Nathaniel Cross at 8:15, not through any dramatic investigation, through Clara Hewish, who knew the neighborhood and knew which streets had which offices, and told him Clement Street was a 12-minute walk north when he asked at breakfast. He went alone, leaving Vivian and Noah at the boarding house with instructions to stay inside, and a deputy marshal who Hale had assigned to remain available, who had apparently taken his assignment literally enough to sleep on Clara's front porch in a chair and drink her coffee at first light without complaint. Cross's office was in a two-story building with a law office sign on the street level. Elias went in. Daniel Cross was a man of about 50 who looked like he hadn't slept well in considerably longer than 4 days. He was behind a desk that had the organized chaos of someone managing too many things at once, and he looked up when Elias came in with the specific wariness of a man who had been expecting someone unpleasant. I was not what Elias had expected. He was not, in any obvious way, a villain. He was tired and worried, and he had ink on his left hand and the expression of a man carrying something heavy. "My name is Elias Mercer," Elias said. "I came to Denver with Vivian Holloway. The documents she was carrying are in Judge Hale's custody as of yesterday evening." Cross sat back in his chair. Something happened in his face that was not guilt and was not relief, but was the complicated hybrid of both that you see in people who have been doing something that they justified to themselves and are now being told the justification no longer matters. "She made it," he said. "She made it," Elias said. He sat across from Cross without being invited. "I want to know where you stand." Cross looked at him. "Who are you to her?" "I'm the man who helped her get here," Elias said. "Tell me where you stand." Cross was quiet for a moment, turning a pen over in his fingers. "I got a visit from Crow's attorney 4 months ago," he said. "A man named Fitch. He made it very clear that if I continued pursuing the Carver Valley case, there would be consequences." He paused. "He also made it clear that there was an alternative arrangement available, one that would benefit me financially and require me to simply slow the process down, lose a few letters, misdirect a few communications." "Did you take it?" "No," Cross said. And then, after a pause, "I didn't take his money, but I was slow. I was afraid and I was slow. And the effect of being afraid and slow was..." He stopped. "The letters she sent me. I received 3 of them. I didn't respond because I was being watched, and I didn't know how to communicate safely. The other 4, I think Fitch's people intercepted them before they reached me." He looked at his desk. "When I went to Hale in Dalton, I thought I could file with what I had, the copies I'd been building. I didn't know she had the originals herself. I didn't know what she was carrying." He paused. "Hale sent me back. Said it wasn't enough." "It wasn't," Elias said. "I know that now." Elias looked at the man across from him and made the specific assessment that Garrett had made of him by the fire. Not of whether he was good or bad, which was too simple a frame for what Cross actually was, but of whether he was useful, whether he was capable of doing the thing that needed to be done now that the thing that needed to be done had changed. "Hale is hearing the case," Elias said. "He's issuing a subpoena for Crow. His attorney will file motions. This is going to need someone in the courtroom who knows this case from the beginning, someone who can anticipate Fitch's arguments and counter them." He held Cross's look. "That's you, if you want to be." Cross was quiet for a long moment. "After what I didn't do." "I'm not asking you to be redeemed," Elias said. It came out more direct than he'd planned, but once it was out, it felt accurate, so he left it. "I'm asking if you can do the work. Vivian needs someone who knows the case. You know it. The rest of it..." He paused. "The rest of it is between you and her." Cross turned his pen over once more. Then he set it down. "Yes," he said. "I can do the work." Elias stood. "Hale's office, 10 o'clock. I'll tell her you're coming." He walked back to the boarding house in the morning light, and he told Vivian what Cross had said without editorializing it, giving her the facts the same way he'd give facts about terrain. "This is what's there. Here is what it means. The decision about what to do with it is yours." She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He was afraid," she said. "Yes. That's not nothing." "No," Elias said. "It isn't." She looked out the boarding house window at the street. "I'm angry at him," she said. "I want to say that plainly. The 4 months he was slow. I was running. Noah was running. Thomas was dying." She paused. "But I also know that Fitch visited him, and I know what Fitch visiting people means. The Millard notary disappeared. The man had reason to be afraid." She looked back at Elias. "Can he do the work?" "I think so," Elias said. "Then he can come to Hale's office," she said. "And we'll see what happens when I'm in the same room with him." She said it without drama, simply, the way she said most things. "If I can't be in the same room with him and do what needs to be done, I'll tell you. That's all I can promise right now." "That's enough," Elias said. She nodded. She looked at Noah, who was at the window watching the street below with the focused interest he gave everything. "Noah," she said. He looked at her. "We have a meeting this morning," she said. "And after that, we're going to be in Denver for a while. Weeks, probably. Maybe longer." He processed this. "Staying in one place?" "Staying in one place?" The expression that moved through his face was not simple enough to be called relief. It was the expression of a child receiving information that is good, but whose goodness he cannot quite accept all at once, because he has learned structurally not to accept good things all at once because they have a way of being revised. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at Elias, and then he looked back at the street. "Okay," he said, carefully, like he was holding it at arm's length until he could verify it further. The meeting at Hale's office was the first time Vivian and Nathaniel Cross had been in the same room, and it was not comfortable. Cross came in at 10 o'clock looking like a man walking into something he deserved, and Vivian looked at him for a long moment when he entered and said nothing for 5 seconds that felt considerably longer, and then she said, "Sit down. We have work to do." And they worked. What followed was not a reconciliation. It was two professionals who had a shared objective and the combined knowledge to pursue it, operating in the same space with the specific tension of people who have complicated history and are choosing, for the duration of this task, to put it to one side. Cross knew Fitch's methods. He knew the counter-arguments Crow's team would make. He knew which aspects of the documentary evidence were most legally vulnerable and needed additional support. He sat across from Vivian and Hale's clerk and went through the case piece by piece, and Vivian answered his questions with complete precision, and neither of them pretended the previous 4 months hadn't happened, but neither of them made it the subject of the meeting, because the subject of the meeting was the work. Elias sat against the wall and watched this and thought about what it cost each of them. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of practical grace that people talk about abstractly and rarely manage in real circumstances, and neither of them was managing it cleanly. Cross kept looking at his hands when Vivian answered him, and Vivian's jaw was tight in a way that she was controlling through active effort. But they were managing it, imperfectly and sufficiently, which was all that the situation required. At the end of 2 hours, Cross had a complete working understanding of the documentary record, and Hale's clerk had a filed preliminary brief, and the case had the shape of something that could be argued in a courtroom. Cross stood to leave and paused at the door and said to Vivian, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix the time, but I want to say it." Vivian looked at him. "I know you are," she said. "Do good work, and we'll call it even." It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical and in some ways more difficult than forgiveness. It was a decision to use what was available rather than hold out for what she deserved, because what she deserved and what the situation offered were not the same thing. And she was a woman who had been making that exact calculation for 14 months and had gotten very good at it. Cross nodded and left. Hale issued his preliminary order 3 days later. Crow's attorney, Fitch, exactly as Garrett had named him, filed 4 counter-motions in the first week. Hale denied all 4. Fitch appealed 2 of the denials. Hale held both appeals. It had the quality of a wall being hit by water. The water was persistent and creative and found every crack it could, and the wall simply remained a wall. The hearing was scheduled for the 4th week. Elias stayed in Denver. He sent a telegraph to the Federal Survey Office, explaining his continued delay, and received a response that was professionally irritated and operationally accommodating, because federal survey work was governed by federal timelines, and the alternative was finding someone else. And finding someone else took longer than waiting for Mercer. He told them he'd be available in 6 weeks, which was optimistic, and they accepted it because they didn't have a better option. He stayed at Clara Howish's boarding house, in the room on the 2nd floor, and he helped with the things that needed helping with. He fixed the hinge on Clara's back gate that had been wrong for 2 years, because he had the tools and the time, and Clara's gratitude took the form of slightly larger portions at the dinner table, which was a practical gratitude he respected. He found Noah a used book about natural formations and geological survey, the kind of book that explained why rocks were what they were, which was exactly the category of question Noah had been directing at the world. And Noah absorbed it with the same focused attention he gave everything, and started asking Elias questions about it, the why, of a child who has found a subject that matches the scale of his curiosity. Elias answered all of them. He didn't think about this too carefully. He was aware that he was doing something that had a shape to it, that he was in the specific and impermanent way of a man who has stopped holding everything at arm's length, allowing himself to be present in a situation that had people in it. He was aware that this was not the same as anything permanent. He was aware that he was a surveyor who had a contract in an empty cabin and no particular claim on the domestic warmth of Clara Hewish's boarding house, and the two people who occupied room 4. I was also aware that when Noah knocked on his door at 7 in the morning with the geological survey book and a question about limestone formation, he opened the door without the beat of hesitation that used to precede everything. Vivian he saw at meals and in the evenings and in the hallway outside Hale's office on the days when the legal proceedings required her presence, which was most of them. She was not easy to know. He understood that more clearly now than he had in the first days, when the urgency of movement had simplified everything into action and reaction. She was private in the way that people are private when they've learned that openness is costly, and she was funny in a dry, quiet way that surprised him the first time and then became something he looked for. She had opinions about things that had nothing to do with the case, about the way certain trees grew, about a story she'd read years ago, about the quality of Denver coffee versus frontier coffee. And she offered these opinions the way you offer something you're not sure will be received, tentatively at first, then with more confidence as she found they were received without being made into something larger than they were. He told her about the survey work, about what it actually was, the mathematics of it, the way you triangulate a position from 3 fixed points, the way a landscape that looks featureless from a distance reveals its structure when you know how to read it. She listened with the same quality she gave everything, actually listening, not waiting for her turn to speak, and she asked questions that were not polite questions but were questions that indicated she'd understood what he'd said and wanted to go further into it. He told her about his wife, about Ellen, who had been practical and impatient and had thought his attachment to the survey work was slightly absurd, and had also understood that it was structural to him and had never asked him to change it. He told her about the particular quality of a marriage that was not romantic in the conventional sense, but was genuinely companionate. Two people who had decided that their strengths complemented each other's weaknesses, and who had made that decision work through active daily choice. He told her this over several evenings, not all at once, the way you tell things that matter when you're no longer in a hurry. Vivian told him about the Holloway Ranch, about what it had been before, the specific quality of the light in the valley, in the early morning, the way the creek that ran through the property had a particular sound that she'd fallen asleep to for the first 8 years of her marriage, and that she'd heard in her memory every night since, whether she wanted to or not. She told him about her father-in-law Thomas, who had been a difficult man in most respects, and a good man in the ways that mattered, who had taught her to ride and to read a land deed and to argue for herself in a room full of men who didn't expect her to, and whose death she had learned of in a telegraph office in Alderton, standing between Noah and the door, alone. She did not cry when she told him this. She had, he understood, cried everything she had available to cry about Thomas a long time ago in the private spaces between public emergencies. What was left was the clear, specific grief of someone who has processed something as fully as grief can be processed, which is not the same as being finished with it, but is the difference between drowning and swimming. The hearing itself lasted 2 days. Silas Crowe appeared the first morning in a suit that cost more than most people in that courtroom made in a year, with 2 attorneys flanking him, Fitch and a second man, brought in from the east, whose presence was clearly intended to signal the magnitude of resource Crowe could bring to bear. He looked at Vivian when she entered the courtroom, and the look was not threatening. It was the look of a man who had not fully accepted that the balance of power in the room was different from what it had been in every room he'd occupied for the past 20 years. Vivian looked back at him. She held his gaze for exactly the length of time it took her to find her seat, and then she looked at the documents in front of her and did not look at him again for the remainder of the proceedings. Cross was good. This was not a simple thing to acknowledge, given everything, but it was accurate. He presented the documentary evidence with the precise, methodical clarity of someone who knew the case from its foundation and had spent the preceding weeks building an argument that was structurally sound in a way that Fitch's counter-arguments kept finding no purchase on. He put the original deeds on the table beside the forged transfer documents and walked Hale through the ink analysis point by point. He presented the 4 sworn depositions. He presented the notary's letter, the one that described the certification process, and the anomalies the notary had observed. He presented Garrett's written deposition, which had been taken and notarized before Garrett left Denver, and which described in specific detail the instructions received from Crow's organization and the methods used to acquire the Carver Valley land. When Fitch objected to Garrett's deposition on the grounds that Garrett was an interested party with criminal exposure of his own, Hale looked at the objection for approximately 3 seconds and said, "Overruled. The weight to be given the testimony is for this court to determine. Proceed." Crow's second attorney tried a different approach on the second day, not attacking the documents directly, which the ink analysis had made very difficult, but attacking the chain of custody. How could the court be certain these documents hadn't been altered by the party presenting them? How could the court verify that Thomas Holloway's deed, produced by a man who had been paid by Crow himself, had not been manufactured for this proceeding? Hale said, "The court has engaged an independent document examiner whose report is in evidence. The examiner's finding is that all documents are consistent with their claimed ages and origins. Do you have a counter-examination to present?" Fitch said they would need time to engage their own examiner. Hale said, "You've had 6 weeks since the case was opened. The time for that was then." He looked at his papers. "Continue." Vivian testified in the second half of the second day. She sat in the witness chair with her hands in her lap, and she answered the questions Cross put to her with the same precision she'd brought to everything else. Dates, locations, observations, the specific details of how she'd come to understand what the documents meant and what she'd done to protect them. She described the 14 months. She described the notary who had disappeared. She described the telegraph from the federal land office that said "do not come," and the Merritt's Crossing operator's account of the men who came asking about it. When Fitch cross-examined her, he tried 3 different approaches to destabilize her account, suggesting the timeline was inconsistent, suggesting her description of the forgery was based on lay analysis rather than expertise, suggesting that her own interest in the property created a bias that made her testimony unreliable. She answered each one without rising to it, without defensiveness, with the flat, clear accuracy of someone whose account is true and who has therefore nothing to manage except the truth. At one point, Fitch said, "Mrs. Holloway, isn't it possible that you misidentified the ink on these documents? That what you perceived as evidence of forgery was simply age variation in the original?" Vivian said, "The independent document examiner's report addresses that question on page 4. Would you like me to walk through it?" Fitch said no. Hale ruled the following morning. He ruled from the bench, which meant he'd decided before he sat down and was reading from prepared notes. And the reading had a quality of inevitability that was not the same as drama, but was its own kind of weight. He found the original Holloway land deed and the 10 accompanying original deeds to be authentic documents that predated and superseded the transfer documentation filed with the county recorder. He found the transfer signatures to be inconsistent with the authenticated originals in ways that were documented and verifiable. He ordered the immediate restoration of land title to the 11 surviving family claims, and in the case of the Holloway parcel, to Vivian Holloway and her son Noah, identified by name in the ruling. He froze all of Crow's assets in the affected region pending a full investigation. He referred the evidence of criminal fraud and conspiracy to the federal prosecutor's office, explicitly noting the evidence relating to the compromise of the federal land office. He said, looking at Crow directly, which was the only moment in the entire proceeding that carried anything like the drama the situation deserved. "This court finds that the evidence before it constitutes a systemic and deliberate effort to defraud ordinary citizens of their property through forgery, bribery, and intimidation. The law exists for precisely these circumstances." Silas Crow sat in his expensive suit and said nothing. His attorneys filed for an emergency stay within the hour. It was denied. The prosecutor's office opened an investigation the following week. Crow's attorney Fitch was named in the referral. The man in the federal land office, a regional records clerk named Aldous Park, who had received 11 separate payments from an account connected to Crow's holding company over 3 years, was identified through the records Garrett had described, which the prosecutor's office obtained with a federal warrant. Park resigned the day the warrant was served and was arrested 2 days later at a stage depot heading east. Roy Deal was arrested at a way station 40 miles south of Denver, which meant he hadn't left when Elias had assumed he had, or had left and come back, or had simply been waiting at a remove for something that was now not going to happen. He was charged with criminal threatening and harassment in connection with the federal case. The charges were not enormous, but they were federal, which made them stick in a way that state charges in Crow's territory might not have. Crow himself fought. Of course he did. He was a man who had built something from nothing by never stopping, and he applied that quality to his own legal defense with the same resource and determination he'd applied to everything else. His attorneys filed. Hale denied. They appealed. The appeals took months, but the land was restored. That happened first, and it happened in full. And for the families in the Carver Valley, who had been holding pieces of paper that said they owned nothing where their parents and grandparents had worked, the land coming back was the thing that mattered. Not the legal proceedings, not the federal investigation, not what happened to Silas Crow eventually. The land. Elias got a letter from the Federal Survey Office in the 5th week asking when he planned to return to his contract. He wrote back saying he needed 2 more weeks. They wrote back saying they could give him one. He wrote back saying he needed 2 and enclosed his professional assessment of why the additional week was operationally justified, which was detailed enough that the office approved it without further argument, because arguing with Mercer's professional assessments was a thing they'd learned not to do. He used the 2nd week to go to Blackstone Ridge. He went alone, on a rented horse, and he packed the cabin where he'd stored his survey equipment and his books and the small number of personal things he'd accumulated in 11 years of living in the particular way he'd been living. He didn't pack everything. Some things he simply left. The older equipment, the worn-out things, the accumulated weight of a life lived in productive isolation. He packed what he cared about and what he needed, and he came back to Denver with 2 saddlebags and the specific lightness of a man who has put down something he didn't realize he'd been carrying until he stopped. He told Vivian he'd been to the cabin. She asked what it had been like to go back. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about things she asked him. Smaller than I remembered, he said. Not in a bad way. Just, I'd been living in it in my head as the size it was when I was living there, and going back I could see it was just a cabin. He paused. It was a place I was in for a while. It was a good place. But it wasn't... He stopped. What? She said. It wasn't where I was supposed to stay, he said. He hadn't known that was what he was going to say until he said it, and having said it, he found that it was accurate, and he left it there. She looked at him. That measuring, cataloging look, and underneath it something that had been opening slowly over the preceding weeks, incrementally, like a door being opened against a resistance that was not opposition, but was the specific, careful caution of someone who had learned that open doors cost something and was choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to open this one anyway. The Holloway parcel, she said. It's in the valley, 300 acres. She paused. It's been empty for 2 years. Crow didn't farm it, he just held it. The house is standing. Thomas's foreman, a man named Briggs, he and his wife have been watching it. They wrote me after the ruling. I know, Elias said. You showed me the letter. The valley, she said. The land needs surveying. The original survey documentation was submitted as part of the title restoration, but it's old, 15, 20 years, and the boundaries need to be reconfirmed. It's a federal requirement for the title transfer to finalize. She held his gaze. I was wondering if you knew anyone qualified to do that kind of survey. He looked at her. I might, he said. Someone who knows the Carver Valley region. I've surveyed adjacent land, he said. I have the existing maps. It would be a reasonable extension of previous work. It would probably take a few weeks, she said, to do it properly. Probably, he said. Maybe longer, if the boundaries are as old as you're saying. She held his gaze for another moment. There was nothing coy about it. She was not performing lightness. She was a woman asking a man a question that had more than one level and trusting him to understand all the levels, because she was tired of managing information and had decided that trusting him to understand was a risk worth taking. I'd need somewhere to stay while I was working, he said. There's a bunkhouse on the property, she said. Thomas's foreman uses it. Plenty of room. That would work, he said. She nodded. Then she looked at her hands, a gesture she made when she was finished performing composure and was just being a person, and said, Elias, I want to be honest with you about what I'm asking. All right, he said. I'm asking if you want to come with us, she said. Not to survey the land, although that's real and it needs doing. I'm asking if you want to come with us to the valley and see what... She stopped. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm asking if you want to see what it is, what it might be. She paused. I haven't asked anyone anything in a long time. He thought about 11 years. He thought about a cabin that was smaller than he'd remembered. He thought about a 4-year-old girl who had asked why about everything. And the way asking why about everything was not a trait that died with one child, but was something that persisted in the world and turned up in a 7-year-old boy with gray eyes who asked about limestone and carried the geological survey book everywhere now, and had started leaving it on Elias's windowsill when he was done with it, which was how Noah Holloway communicated most of the things he considered important. He thought about bread that was stale and a woman who hadn't asked for charity and a child who hadn't eaten in days, and the specific moment when a man who has been very carefully not being present decides, without being entirely certain why, to be present. It was not a straight line. None of it was. It was the crooked, hard-won, imperfect path of people who had been shaped by loss and difficulty and were choosing, with full knowledge of what choosing cost, to choose something anyway. "Yes," he said. "I want to see what it is." She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of someone receiving something they'd asked for and finding it real, which was not the same as relief and was not the same as happiness, but was its own thing. A careful, grounded opening, the kind that comes when you've been cautious long enough that receiving something good requires a moment of adjustment before you can hold it properly. "Okay," she said. Noah found them 20 minutes later in the parlor, book under one arm, with a question about alluvial deposits that he'd been saving. He looked at the two of them, and then he looked at the book, and then he looked back at them with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "Are we going home?" he said. It was not a simple question. He'd asked it without expecting a simple answer, in the tone of someone who understands that home is a word with more than one meaning, and that the meaning it has right now is something being negotiated. Vivian looked at Elias. He looked at her. The specific, ordinary human moment of two imperfect people in a warm room deciding together what the answer was. "Yes," Vivian said, "we're going home." Noah looked at this answer from several angles. Then he opened his book to the alluvial deposit page and said, "Can we talk about this first? Because I think what happened to the creek on the south end of the valley is related, and I want to understand it before we get there." Elias took the book from him. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Tell me what you're thinking." And Noah, who had been 7 years old in a hard world for long enough that he'd learned the value of being heard, sat down between them and began to explain. Outside Denver went about its ordinary business. The noise of a city that did not know and would not particularly care that something small and true had been settled in a boarding house parlor on a Tuesday afternoon. The summer light came through the window the way summer light does, indifferent and warm, landing on a book about rocks and 3 people working out the shape of what came next. It was not a perfect ending. Crow's legal battle would continue for another 8 months before the criminal verdict ended it. Cross would make mistakes in the proceedings and correct them. Garrett would surface once, months later, in a brief letter to Hale that confirmed he was alive and offered one additional piece of testimony, and then disappear again into whatever geography suited a man rebuilding himself from the outside in. The Holloway parcel needed more work than anyone had anticipated, and the winter of 1879 would be hard in the valley. And there would be days when the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on all of them in ways that a good ending couldn't fully lift. But the land was theirs. And the boy who had gone to sleep on a stranger's shoulder in the streets of Denver was going to grow up with his name on a deed that no one could touch. And the woman who had carried 14 months of truth in a leather satchel pressed to her side, who had held her chin up through all of it, not out of pride but out of refusal, was going to sleep tonight without the specific weight of something that was hers alone to carry. And the man who had pushed back his chair in a dusty saloon and picked up a plate of stale bread and walked across a room because a child had made a sound that he recognized. That man was going home too, which was something he had not been able to say for 11 years, and which he did not say dramatically or even consciously, but which was the simple, unadorned truth of where he was going. Sometimes the most important thing a person does is a small thing, an unremarkable thing, the kind of thing that takes 10 seconds and costs nothing except the willingness to pay attention to what's in front of you rather than what's behind you. Sometimes you push back a chair. Sometimes you pick up the plate. And sometimes, in the particular alchemy of ordinary human decency, that is exactly enough.